The story that will capture the human soul says so. The life of the protagonist proceeded without any adventures. He was born into an ordinary family and spent his days without problems and fuss. He had just an ordinary and boring everyday life in which nothing special happened, and he thought his life was doomed. But things were much different out there. Eventually, everything changed for him, and it was worth it for him to stumble into a game called Hero's Fate. For there he became a master of the game, for he knew how to dispose of computer games very well. The next day, arriving home in the evening, he was glad, because finally he can be alone. And in his heart, he just hated school. He realized there was nothing wrong with his love of solitary gaming. Of course, he's the king of it. But when you play a single-player game, you can always save and restart it to start over. And if you use cheats, you can overcome all kinds of restrictions and become the strongest. And the world exists only for one player. Losing, the hero said he would try to play again. Starting the game again, he turned on his broadcast, in which he showed how he plays. After reading a few messages, the guy said that these guys don't know how to praise at all. But at that moment, suddenly one of the people watching the broadcast sent him $10, from which the guy was very surprised. The guy thought that this is a great generosity and will send him personally words of thanks. But after these words, the same person sent him $1,000. Seeing this, the guy just froze on the spot. He couldn't believe it, and coming even closer to the monitor, looked at the donation. But after that, people began to condemn him again, because after such a thing, he did not thank the sender. But the sender, under the nickname Dea, sent him an email. The guy, seeing it, was surprised, and of course he was very curious about what it said. The sender wrote that he is a game master, and he is a viewer who enjoys watching his channel. After that, he found out that the sender is a game developer. But the guy decided to refrain from that, but saw how the sender wrote that no one was able to pass the beta version. He immediately became very interested in this. The sender asked the player if he would like to try it. The guy immediately glowed, because he realized that even an average person like him could become special. He shouted at the top of his voice that he was willing to give it a try. Immediately afterward, he installed a game called Hero's Destiny. The story of the game stated that in the year 249 in the imperial calendar, the kingdom of Jaipur invaded the neighboring kingdom of Rock and turned it into a solid sea of fire. And that started a tumultuous era. And the hero was born with a small and insignificant soul, and he has to survive the turbulent times and become a hero. And then he has to bring down his hammer of justice on an evil god and ascend to the throne. And if he does that, he can make any wish he wants. And suddenly the guy realized and said, that's why the name of this game is The Fate of the Hero. Of course, the graphical part here so bad. Still, as the sender said, he created it himself, so it's not bad in principle. And suddenly a window appeared in front of him and asked him to enter his name. The hero immediately found a loophole and said that after all, it is not so important, so he called himself Gamemaster. The system welcomed the Gamemaster to the continent of Erin. Seeing his location, he was a little surprised, but he didn't realize what was this, and there was no training here. However, it was already clear to him, so he didn't think it would require it. Suddenly, turning around, he saw a man. It turned out to be the village chief. The headman told the boy that this was the first time he was seeing him. And why had he come to this village? Behind the screen, the guy didn't realize what else was it, and searched for options for an answer. But a window opened before him, from which he was frightened, for he realized that he would have to write himself. In response, the guy told the headman to give him all his gold coins, or else he would kill all the villagers. For the hero, this seemed like an obvious answer because after all, he needs to survive. But the headman picked up speed and hitting the guy's head with his stick, asked him who he thought he was. The guy didn't expect such an outcome. The system immediately told him that his eyelids were getting heavy, and in this game, he's dead, and the cause of his death is a blunt wound. But does he wish to try again? The system asked. The guy wiped all the sweat from his face, for he had never seen such a number. He had died from a normal conversation with an NPS, but knowing himself how he likes to play, he of course decided to try his chance again. Finding himself in the same place, the headman said he was seeing the guy for the first time. And why did he come to this village? The hero made a cute face and replied that he had gotten lost, and has not eaten or drunk for a long time, and asks the elder to show some compassion to the poor man. The elder replied to the stranger to just follow him quietly, Upon entering the room, the old man told the stranger to drink this glass and tread in peace. In response, the hero thanked him for such a kind gesture. Taking the first sip, he immediately lost his balance, and the system said that he was poisoned by a poisonous potion. In the end, he lost again, and the cause of death was the deadly poison. But then another solution occurred to him. He decided to pull out the internet cable. The guy said that since there was no internet connection, the NPS couldn't do anything to him, and now he's definitely screwed. When he met with the Gamemaster, he ended up losing again, and the Gamemaster said something ridiculous, for which he got his tongue cut off. And after the third defeat, the guy couldn't take it anymore and threw his playing instrument into the wall. He realized that he couldn't handle it even with the internet turned off. But the person who sent him the email is the creator of the game, and the people online have no idea who he is. Still, what is the name of the development team, he thought. Suddenly seeing the time on the wall, he said it was past midnight, and that was enough from him for today. But he didn't forget to save his game. He also didn't have any thoughts of having to chat with the NPCs, equal to if he had been told that the world of the hero's destiny actually existed. There was no way he would have believed it, and that's why no one made it to the end during the beta. As he closed his eyes, he felt something stirring in him, and from that moment on, he put his whole soul into being special, not realizing how much of his time he would waste. Each time after the origin, he remembered to save, for he immersed himself in the game again and again. And now it's been 10 years since he started playing the game of Hero's Destiny, and already he was sitting at his job. But here he was not alone. His assistant turned to him and said that she had sent him the redacted documents. In response, the guy thanked her for such help. But time flew quickly, and he did not even notice how the evening came. The girl asked if he had finished already, and they had done a good job together. In response, the boy thanked her for her hard work. But the girl decided not to end the evening and offered him dinner at her house. The guy was surprised and apologized, saying that he couldn't and he had to go home. After all, he has a very important day today and he promises to have dinner with her some other time. The girl was again upset after his words, because he again refused her. Arriving home, the guy took off his clothes and said that today he will complete the game Fate of the Hero. As he started to complete the game, he didn't even notice how it had already dawned outside, and he finally became the first person to enter the Hall of Fame. The guy rejoiced and said that this was the end, and finally he had passed it. But still there was something punishing in his soul. After all, it had been 10 years since he started playing it, and in all that time wished he could be special. But his life is still mediocre, and now he's devastated and it's like he's had a second life. In the game, he was a black prince named Gael Krakow, Cardinal Cesare Ravallo, and a witch named Celestina Yulin, and these are such fascinating and unique characters. Their reactions were so lifelike that it was impossible to distinguish them from real people. Sometimes he wondered if there were such people in his world too. Realizing this, Guy closed his face and said that this is really the end. But suddenly a notification came to him. A full screen was asking him if he wanted to undertake a new adventure. He didn't even realize what it was, but after reading carefully, he realized it was a hidden script. And the continuation of his game is the fate of the hero. He realized that if he could feel that thrill and excitement again, he couldn't help but agree. As he agreed to continue, suddenly a miracle happened, and he was teleported to the continent of Erin. A system voice greeted the game master, calling him his apostle. The hero opened his eyes slowly and felt discomfort inside him, and it was hard for him to breathe. He didn't realize yet where he was. After all, a minute ago he was in the room. But he heard a voice that was glad he was awake. The man told the lad that if they didn't have such a valuable potion at their disposal, the Lord would not have met the dawn. The guy opened his eyes wide and didn't understand who this man was or why he was called Mr. Calyx. The boy opened his eyes and asked the man in front of him who he was. The man was surprised, for the healer had not warned him about possible memory loss. The boy thought, "Who is this? And where is he really?" The man suddenly asked if he really didn't remember him. The man said his name was Russell. The guy didn't understand at this point. How do you make sense of that? They're definitely not in Japan, and he's not speaking Japanese. He still understands his speech, though. There's also a pain so bad in his chest it's like he's on fire all over. Grasping at the pain, he wrapped himself in a lump. Russell got scared and apologized, saying that it was all because of his haste. But the prince shouldn't worry. The pain was just a side effect of the potion. It will soon pass. And it looks like the prince will need more time to recover. And he asks the prince to forgive him, and he will visit his master again in the morning. And he closed the door and apologized again. The boy lay in bed like a chained man, but all this time he could not sleep, even the candle on the dresser completely extinguished. In the morning he got up and decided that it was a good dream, and going to the mirror he realized he hadn't imagined it. He definitely felt that he was not in his body, and he didn't even know his name. The prince started to get angry because he could only remember 30 years of his life, and now he couldn't remember a common name. He looked in the mirror again and tried to remember his name, but suddenly a planetary window opened in front of him. He immediately realized that it was a system window, and looking closely he realized that it was the hero's destiny, and he never thought that he would actually be transported to the continent of Erin. And I guess the creator just wanted to stick him in the game. It's a place-based scene in the hero's destiny, and it's the huge continent of Erin. The guy decided he needed to calm down first, but at the moment he grabbed his chest and fell to the floor in pain. He started to feel a hell of a lot of pain, but he hadn't woken up yet. And it turns out this isn't a dream, it's real, which means he's gonna have to get used to this guy's weird name. And according to the system window, his name is Calyx Shaken. And it turns out, if he wants to see his status, this window pops up, and he's the only one who sees this thing. He immediately got excited and decided that he would start by gathering information. After all, if he was careless in this world, he would die in a flash. And he saw that he was the son of Count Shaken. And it is logical that his surname coincides with the name of this territory. That means he is a direct descendant of the great Earl family. He realized that he was very lucky, but decided to read a little more about himself. But suddenly someone knocked on his door. Calyx was wary, for he didn't know who was behind the door. And how should he behave with them? He didn't know what to do. So he decided to take it easy for starters. It would be the end of him if anyone found out he'd taken over this body. But he realized that he was a high-ranking aristocrat, a direct descendant of an Earl family. Calyx made a rough voice and asked who came. The girl answered the prince that it was time for medication. The boy realized it was a maid, and he needs to get used to the new treatment. So he gave her permission to come in. The maid entered and apologized to him. Calyxi was speechless when he saw her. The girl came and got down on one knee and said, "This is the prince's medicine, and he should take it before it got cold." Calyx froze in the moment and didn't know what to say to her. Coming to his senses, he wondered what he was doing. After all, it was the same as saying he wasn't Calyx. The maid saw his strange face and asked, "Is something wrong?" A window immediately opened in front of him and he replied that everything was fine, and decided it was okay if he just tried it. But looking closer through the window, he recognized her name as Lyra. But he thought it was strange that she belonged to the O'Crane lineage of Viscount Kosherin, and thought that meant she was serving someone else and not his family. And why did she have such a high combat power? It's kind of like third class means she can't use mana, but by the standards of her world, her training is on par with special forces, which means she's the best of the best. But things get weird, because she's just a maid. Calyx realized that a member of the Shaken family was injured, but he was being serviced by a maid from another family. And since she's the maid of another family brought the medicine, this stuff is 100 poodle not worth drinking. Lyra got tired of waiting and asked the prince for a drink, but Calyx sighed and told her to put the tray on the table. But the girl proved to be stubborn and asked him to drink the medicine sooner. The prince took the cup in his hands and realized that he wasn't going to drink it. He decided to fake it and abruptly grabbed his stomach and dropped the bowl to the floor, and started screaming that he was in pain. But Lyra saw the bowl falling. She froze in place. But Calyx rejoiced, for she would not be able to poison him. But at the last moment of contact with the floor, Lyra showed her abilities and saved the potion and bowl. Calyx was shocked, for he didn't know she would do such a thing. Calyx was greatly surprised at how quick she was, and his plan fell apart because of her skills. Lyra said she was very lucky she was able to salvage the cure. The prince didn't want to think bad thoughts at all at this point. He could really go off his skates here. And it's definitely poison. And he's not going to drink it anyway, and he'd have to get her away from that cup somehow. Calyx decided to fake that he was about to fall. Lyra noticed him falling and catching him asked if the prince was okay. The prince thought after that, what should he do with her? And suddenly he remembered what the Viscounty Kosherin, whom Lyra serves, is. And he is the son of the Count's first, already deceased, wife. Does he have a half-brother by his second wife? The prince thought. Looking around, he found that he did. And older than him by 16 years. And the maiden name of the count's second wife is Kosharin. And to put it another way, Lyra serves the second wife, which means his stepmother purposefully sent this maid to him. Moreover, she is perfectly trained to kill. And if he dies, his stepmother's son will become the next earl. And as usual, this is a story about the struggle of two brothers for the throne. As expected from the hero's fate, it's going to be insanely hard. Calix told her that he was already fine, and asked the girl how his stepmother was doing. When Lyra heard such a question, she just froze in place. But she answered that the countess was very saddened by the prince's suicide attempt. She even asked her to tell him never to do it again. Calix looked at his chest and wondered if the owner of this body really had such thoughts. And judging by the wound and the status window, it all looked more like he was about to be stabbed. And Prince said he understood, and promises he won't bother her again. The girl answered him that she thought the countess would be very happy to hear his answer. Calix said that she could convey these words to her right now, but the girl replied that she was very sorry, for the prince had not yet taken his medicine. The prince, seeing her look, was shocked, and realized that she won't leave until he takes the medicine, and things are not good. After all, he can't politely ask her to leave. I mean, she's a murderer, and she might do something to him. He's a 30-year-old man in the frail body of a teenage boy with a frail soul. So the prince began to think of a plan of action to save himself. He thought he should scream, but then he decided he shouldn't, in case when he started to scream that maid would slit his throat, but that would kill him even faster. And I guess he has no choice but to drink this poison. But then he thought, why poison? Wasn't it easier to stab him with a knife? And now it's clear that she doesn't want to attract attention. And if he's right, it's a poison that's hard to see, which means his death could be passed off as a suicide. And he knows the name of the poison. It's called slow death. Lyra said that if it's hard for him to swallow, she can help him. The prince actually realized this when he was playing Fate of the Hero. There is only one truth in the game. One should always assume the worst-case scenario, because it can become real. If one wants to live, one must doubt everything and always be on guard. And now, if he refuses, she'll probably make him drink it. And that excites him so much. The hero's fate had backed him into a corner again. Lyra turned to the prince, but the lad answered her that it was all right, and immediately took the medicine and drank it. The system immediately said that he was poisoned with poison's slow death, and the prince got it right. Next thing you know, he started thinking about how he could not pass away, and he needed to do anything that would help him. He remembered Russell saying that if they didn't have such a valuable potion at their disposal, he might not have met the Dawn anymore. Calix asked Lyra if she could get Russell. The girl asked, why would he need him? The prince looked at her menacingly and asked, does he need to report to the maid? Lyra apologized and replied that it was stupid of her to ask such a thing. But Calix said that if she was perfectly aware of everything, then let her follow orders right away. He knew that the top-quality potion that Russell had applied to him was so expensive that it could be exchanged for a lock. And by the looks of it, he was a kind enough uncle to have fought for his life like that. And at least he was hardly a threat to him. Calix saw her leave and immediately stood up. He decided to take a different course of action and do it all himself by ripping the potion back out of his stomach. But he failed and said that he urgently needed to find this thing. The fate of a hero is a very complicated game indeed. He started looking around the room and searching for the potion that would cure him. The system immediately showed him that his eyelids started to get heavy. Calix started looking everywhere and throwing in different directions to find the potion, but every minute he was getting worse. Suddenly, he didn't realize how he lost consciousness and fell to the floor. He wondered if he was going to die like that now, if he could start over again. Or would he really die? Opening his eyes wide, he saw a jug standing right in front of him, which was hidden behind the cabinets. The prince slowly began to crawl towards the jug. Looking at it, he thought, what is this? When he opened the lid, he immediately smelled a strange odor, one that almost made him vomit. He was still thinking, what is this stuff? It tasted like spoiled milk. Looking at the system, he realized it was goat's milk. But he realized that by playing with this spawn of hell, he had learned that yogurt was the antidote to this poison. But can spoiled goat's milk be called yogurt? The prince wondered. But the system warned him once more as his eyelids grew heavy. He realized that this was the third time the warning message had appeared, and he was almost out of time. Kalisk was intensely angry and told Lyra to watch. He would definitely get back at her. Drinking the goat's milk, he passed out completely. And opening his eyes, Russell asked if the prince was awake. Kalisk didn't understand what was going on. And what was his déjà vu? Prince asked the man what he was talking about. But Russell replied that aside from that, what was that mess in the room? And what was the prince making a mess of it? And why was he on the floor in the first place? And no matter how hard he tried to wake him up, he still wouldn't wake up. And he almost called a healer. At that moment, Kalisk was thanking Russell for saving him. And he didn't want to feel that noose around his neck anymore. And no matter what happens, he will definitely survive. And if she decides to do it again, he needs to check the status of this man first. Russell asked Prince if he could hear him. But Prince opened the window and watched his characterization. He saw that Russell is an acting earl. And does that mean he is a temporary earl because the previous earl died without choosing a successor? And since he's a serious soldier, he can trust him a bit. He is his benefactor, having saved his dying body with a potion of the highest quality. Kalisk addressed him as Aaron's representative. Russell asked the prince what happened. The prince replied that, to be honest, he had something to tell Russell, and he told him everything as it was. Hearing this, Russell was surprised and said he was sorry, but there was no proof. Kalisk was saddened and realized that even though he had used such a valuable potion on him, this guy didn't treat him any differently. He was just following the family rules by helping him. Russell told the prince that to him, he was just another successor. And also he must serve the prince honestly and diligently, without a witness or proof. But Kalisk squeezed his hand and began to say that this medicine was sent by someone who intends to snatch his place as the head of this county. And did that mean that he should continue to drink it? The count asked the prince, had he really lost his memories? After all, the Shaken County family is now and has quite a few financial problems, so their budget is very limited. Lyra does the bulk of the work in the family, and they can't be so ungrateful to her. And the prince really doesn't remember that? Or is he just pretending to have lost his memory? Kalisk realized that he had no choice but to provide him with proof. After all, the girl who poisoned him must think he is already dead. Kalisk made up his mind and said that was enough. And he has a favor to ask of Russell. It's not that complicated. Russell wasn't surprised, as the prince is acting very differently than usual. 4 hours later, there was a man who leaked into Count Shaken's castle, who was wearing a black suit. But he was hiding the whole time. After all, the castle was surrounded by guards. He saw that the security system had been reinforced, but looking around, he saw that there was a sewage outlet in the wall. Without thinking for a long time, he cut the grate and got inside the castle, but was surprised that there were no guards inside. But looking into the main room, he noticed that there was someone lying on the bed. Opening the hood, it turned out to be Lyra. She thought it was a special poison, and she was sure he died painlessly. Lyra took out a pre-prepared letter and placed it on the table. But beyond that, she decided to make it valid and put the prince's seal on it. Lyra realized that half of the task was done, and she had the rest to finish. But suddenly everything in the moment turned around, and she felt a sharp blade in front of her face. The man told her not to move from her position. Lyra immediately realized whose voice it was. Lyra decided to show her fortitude and said it was too late. And Prince Kalisk is dead. And now the county of Shaken belongs to Granbane, and gave the name of the man who put the sword to her neck. Lyra asked Russell, shouldn't he be looking out for Shaken County, not the weak and frail prince? But even then, everything changed in a second, and Kalisk came up and called himself a genius. Lyra saw the prince alive and was shocked. Kalisk said that slow death was so interesting to him, and poisoning is not uncommon in secret confrontations in power struggles between noble families, and in that regard he is well aware. But if the world found out about it, he thought, it would be quite unpleasant. Lyra got angry and immediately grabbed her sword to finish the job, because this shouldn't leak anywhere. She knocked the sword out of the Lord's hands and turned around to attack, but Russell just grabbed her arm. Clutching her hand, Lyra couldn't do anything and screamed in pain. Without thinking for a long time, Russell just started beating her and hitting her on the most painful human points. Kalisk at this point roughly understood it, but here was what a 3-grade difference between the two of them was just amazing. Russell was just an intimidating pepper. The prince went on to say that, like he said earlier, poisoning is a common way to kill, but only an idiot would leave behind physical evidence and a witness. and anyone who tries to kill a nobleman will be sentenced to execution. This applies to people of noble blood as well. The prince put the paper on the table and said the proof is right there. And their witness would actually be herself, young Lady Lyra. Lyra suddenly realized her mistake and decided to play on it, and in a moment lost consciousness. The prince was surprised by this and asked what she had suddenly done. Russell replied that she had fainted. So after touching her body, he decided to look at her mana core. The prince immediately saw that it was a mana core, and Russell now knows what class Lyra is. Russell said that he thinks she doesn't know how to use the mana breathing method, and apparently her level is only limited by her good physical stats. So it might not be possible to use mana restriction on her. But in a moment, Russell made a face of surprise. The prince immediately noticed his facial expression and thought that he already knew about it. He felt strange when he was asked to hide. Just how much did he know? Calix told him to just tie her up. He wishes to listen to her moans. Russell complied with the prince's orders and sat her on the table and tied her hands so she wouldn't make a mess. But her hands were broken after the way Russell treated her. But Calix didn't leave it at that and started to heal her. The prince told her that when he drank the slow death, he stopped breathing after about a couple to 3 minutes. And it's the perfect suicide poison, because it allows you to die without feeling any pain. He, who'd previously tried to pass away, would have drank her poison. And even I'm sure everyone would have believed that he chose that path himself. And now they're using a fast-acting poison on Lyra. If she was willing to die with him, then she wouldn't lose then. Calix squeezed her face with his hand and asked why. Lyra asked the prince, "What does he mean?" And she thinks that Calix didn't want to die. The prince said she was so devoted to Countess Stella that she was willing to sacrifice her life. As it was, he immediately ordered Russell to open her mouth. Russell replied that he would comply now, but Lyra wasn't scared and said that was just naive. Russell came up behind her and grabbed her face with a firm hand and squeezed her mouth open. The moment Calix pulled out the pill he wanted to feed her. Lyra wondered what it was, for she didn't know. Calix didn't answer anything at first, and threw the pill right down her throat. She immediately smelled a familiar odor. After that, Calix took a jug of liquid and poured it into her mouth, telling Russell to make her swallow it. Russell complied with the order, and Lyra swallowed every last drop. She immediately began to shake. Lyra mangled her face and asked in a quiet voice, "What was that stuff?" Calix replied that he had already said it was poison. The girl asked immediately, "What kind of poison?" The prince didn't bother to hide anything and replied that it was Sidis's puppet. Hearing this, Lyra just changed and started screaming that there was no way it could be. How did a frail and useless child manage to get something like that? Calix replied that as long as he had gold in his pocket, he could get anything. If he had to name the secret ingredient, he would straight up say it was white radish. Lyra, hearing those words, just froze in place. She came to her senses a bit and said she couldn't believe it. But the prince knew, in order for him to survive in this world, he must not be exposed, and for that, he only needed to understand the continent's terminology correctly. And it wasn't like people would suspect anything if he was getting into his role. Calix tells the girl that he will release her today, have her head straight to her master and inform him that the assassination was a success. Lyra asked the prince, did he think she would listen to him? The prince answered her bluntly, "It's not like she wants to die. There are over 3,000 kinds of antidotes in a Sidious puppet, and each one depends on how it's dosed. And the perfect antidote for her is this." And he pointed his finger right at himself. Lyra tried to rip the ropes off herself, but the prince told her that her stubbornness would get her nowhere, so she would have to obey him unconditionally. As she tried to break free, the poison entered her body faster and spread. The prince asked what was her answer. Lyra immediately agreed and asked him to cure her. But Calix wasn't surprised and asked her what was it. He's actually trying to help her. Lyra realized her mistake and asked him politely that he would cure her quickly. Russell at this point thought, why is she so weak-willed? Lyra couldn't stop begging the prince and even let a tear fall. But Calix even managed to blush and saw that the spoiled goat's milk worked without fail. He told Russell to untie her, but the Lord asked if everything was going to be okay. That man tried to kill him. Calix replied that since she was an important witness, they would protect her dignity. Russell was surprised and asked, "Dignity?" Lyra couldn't take it either and insulted the Lord and told him to untie her quickly. After all, she was about to leak. Lyra screamed at the top of her voice that even outside the castle could hear her moans and screams. After the job was done, Lyra got down on her knee and said that she would report that the assassination had succeeded. Calix listened to her and trusted her. He realized to fool the man behind Lyra, he would need his own strong steed. Suddenly, Russell turned to him, but the prince realized that the Lord probably had a lot of things to ask. He asked the lad, how did he get all this knowledge? But Calix answered him that he wouldn't believe him, even if he said he had counted the book. But Russell said that if the prince read such a book, he would be sentenced to death, and highly doubted that such a forbidden and dangerous thing would have been left in the castle. Calix knew that Russell would not believe him if he said it was from another world, and if he did, disaster would ensue. The prince said the dagger he had plunged into his chest. Would Russell remember him? Russell replied that he did, and asked the prince why he was suddenly talking about him. Calix replied that this dagger is a family heirloom, inherited from his mother. There is a legend that this thing has mysterious powers. However, it is not just a legend. Russell asked him if the prince was being serious. Calix realized that Russell didn't believe it, and said that no one would think that the only way to unlock the secret of this relic was by stabbing himself in the heart. Russell replied that this was very strange. If such a rare thing existed, the whole world would know about it. Calix couldn't stand it and asked Lord if he knew about Claire's dagger. Russell was surprised and asked the prince, does he mean to say that the dagger he received from the Grand Countess is Claire's real dagger? And then Calix saw that he was caught. But Russell went on to say that Claire's dagger is a treasure among treasures. If indeed he has it, that explains everything. But really, Calix had never seen it before. But Russell asked, does anyone else know about it? The prince replied that he didn't, and Russell was the first person he told about it, and asked the Lord if he thought about Lyra's story. The Lord asked in what way. Calix replied that all of his father's movements had been revealed. A knight about to reach 7th grade was attacked and died, and all the knights in the guard actually died too, the prince asked. And did Russell really believe such a silly story? And then the Lord thought that the prince needed his power, and realized that in the battle for the inheritance he was forbidden to take sides. But there's no doubt about Earl Collins' premeditated murder. In this situation, there is only emotional evidence, not physical evidence. But he started to deny everything, because as a soldier, he believes that he should not get involved in politics. He decided to appeal to the prince. But Calix interrupted him and shouting asked him why his father had to die. If it was intentional, who was behind it? And if he found out about it, how would he get revenge on his enemy? Calix said that his father and co-master was murdered, and the Kosharin family is the mastermind behind the assassination attempt, and Granbane is from that family. And if he becomes count, it will be too late for revenge, and he doesn't have to give up just because it looks difficult. And Russell considers himself a true knight, following the family that killed his lord and tried to kill the direct heir. Russell couldn't resist saying such strong words and got down on his knee and said that he swears allegiance to the prince. Calix turned to Captain Russell. The captain replied that he had just renounced the beliefs to which he had adhered for more than 50 years, and asks the prince not to forget it. The prince realized that Russell was a strong man of the 6th class, and in addition, the most powerful man in the county, and now he has become his ally. And Russell the tiger, silently marching his way. And how good it was that the reins of vengeance tightened. Calix asked him to raise his head. And you don't have to give allegiance to someone who doesn't even have the title of knight yet. Russell replied to the prince not to worry, for surely he will make him stronger. And he is here to help him. Calix was surprised, and said that there was clearly more to those words. And if he didn't change the subject now, they would start training right away. And the prince decided to say that the countess used a nefarious method, but left behind evidence and a witness. And because of that, they will be able to destroy the faction she belongs to. This is the beginning of their revenge. Russell replied that was correct, and asked what was required of an old man like him. Calix smiled and replied that he would tell him everything in detail now. The next day, the countess gathered everyone for a council, and looked around and said that everyone had arrived. But people wondered why the countess was sitting on the throne, and it seemed to them that the knights had been on watch all night. The countess smiled at everyone and began to say that she thought some of them didn't know it yet. After all, the news came in that yesterday Prince Calix committed suicide by drinking a slow death poison. One of the counselors asked, "Isn't that the famous suicide poison? And death by it is inevitable." On the other hand, he was answered that if the first prince died, would factions no longer matter? The man in the black robe said that he needed to establish strong ties too. The countess was smiling at this time, and saw that thanks to the death of bloody Calix, it was certain that the title of count would be passed to Granbane. The council began to ask who would then become the next earl. Someone replied that it had probably already been decided, but they were not reassured by this and asked if the countess could become the count's representative. At this point, Calix listened to everything and said that it was getting interesting, and asked his men if they were ready, and next turned to Lord Russell. The Lord replied that of course, he would follow him wherever he went. Russell stepped in front of the prince and showed his attire of captain and lord. Who is ready to protect the prince? Calix decided to show up epically and kicked the door open 2 ways, and everyone present was shocked at what they saw. The countess immediately jumped up and her face immediately changed upon seeing Calix. The countess asked why this happened. The counselors immediately began to say that the prince was alive. And why is Russell, the acting count, beside him? But they began to wonder, from the fact that the prince hadn't actually taken the poison. Calix approached the countess and said that the throne she now sits on does not belong to her. The countess replied that she still had weight here, and asked with a caustic smile, how was the prince feeling? The prince replied that he drank poison because of someone, but luckily he survived, and he immediately threw up, and he was too impatient. The countess stood up and started telling him that misleading people without being completely sure of what you were saying was absolutely horrible. Though he did not recognize her as his mother, he was now treating her like a murderer. She can't forgive him for that attitude. And there's a big hall here, and here he has to take responsibility for what he says. But Calix had told her that even if the truth was revealed, could she continue to behave like this? The countess froze at such words and thought, what is this creep up to? And asked him what he was getting at. Calix replied that he understood everything, and immediately clapped his hands twice, and Lyra walked through the door with her hands tied. The prince said that they would now listen to what the witness would tell them. Everyone began to ask who was this woman. But the countess, seeing a familiar face, started to panic and couldn't believe it. She realized that she was stuck in a dead end. Lyra knelt immediately in front of the prince. Calix asked the girl what her name was. Lyra raised her head to the front table and introduced herself. The countess was already shattered and wondered why this girl was here. Lyra said she was a member of the 1st Special Forces Unit, the Force of Darkness of the Kosharan family. Calix interrogated her. The Force of Darkness? Lyra replied that it is a special squad made up of children with high fighting characteristics. They undergo extreme training at the plateau camp. There they select the best of the best among those who were able to cope with all the training. These children hide their identities to carry out various missions in different parts of the continent. The prince asked her who she pretends to be within the walls of Shaken County. The girl replied that she was Countess Stella's maid. The boy asked her if Lady Stella was aware of her true identity. Lyra answered the prince that she was correct. Stella couldn't stand it and started shouting that she was protesting and it was a conspiracy. The councilman present was surprised and started yelling that Lyra has been serving them for over 5 years. And he couldn't believe that she was a spy. And impersonating another person is a blatant violation of royal law. And now they can officially vote against the Kosharan family. But the other part asked them, what are they doing? They don't have any physical evidence. But someone replied that it's not a problem. And he has a witness. The old man with the long beard was upset at this point and didn't know how to get out of it. But the old man turned to Russell and asked why he was silent. Did he really believe the story of this humble servant girl? Russell turned around and replied that she was not a humble maid at all, but a criminal caught red-handed. And now she confessed to being a spy for the Kosharan family. Let them hear her testimony and then decide for themselves whether it's a conspiracy or not. The old man tried to persuade him, but he failed. On the right side, the counselor turned to the chief treasurer and told him to calm down. The treasurer didn't like that and asked the guy what he meant. Isn't this the word of a sinner right now? Maybe they would listen all the way through. The chamberlain realized that the countess was in a mess that would be hard to get out of. Calix asked the girl what her mission was. She replied that it was to write reports every month. The prince asked her what they were about. The girl replied that she mainly wrote about the expense book of Grafst, created by Chief Treasurer Gidlos, and she had also been engaged in reconnaissance of the late Earl Collins' route of travel. and she wrote about the political mood amongst the vassals. Calix continued, and asked which mission was her last. The girl replied that she was to make the prince drink the poison of slow death, and then sneak into his bedroom to disguise his demise as a suicide and leave a fake will. The prince asked her what was the bottom line then. Lyra replied that she managed to get him to drink the poison, but when she sneaked into the bedroom, she was spotted by Deputy Earl Russell. And then she was caught. Stella got angry and started yelling at her to shut her mouth. And she's asking for proof. Stella just lost her temper and wanted to jump across the table to end this girl for good. She kept saying it was some kind of conspiracy against her. Calix liked that she was asking for proof and told acting Russell to provide it. Russell opened the letter and said it was Prince Calix's fake will, and last night he caught Lyra sneaking into Prince Calix's room and leaving this will. And this is the scroll known to them all as the Scroll of the Memory of the Earth. It has the power to reproduce the evil thoughts of those who have touched it in the form of images. And with the help of this magical scroll, they were able to find out who had instructed the spy. Gidson began to panic and think how to prevent the leak at all costs, and must be gagged immediately. And with his eyes he looked at the other prince. Calix realized that they could see everything with their own eyes, and raising his hand said for them to go into the room. Immediately several people entered the room, and all were masked and armed. The people asked what these things were. Calix said this place is not for the likes of them, and security within the castle grounds is the sacred duty of the knights. The knights just surrounded everyone around them and didn't let them move from their seats. Stella realized at once that there was nothing she could do and no escape. Gidson turned to Russell and asked what that meant. Russell replied that he had already checked the scroll, and he was very shocked by its contents. And there was a high probability of a breach of order, so he decided to back up at once and asked them to understand him correctly. Someone started saying that this is why they called soldiers into the sacred Great Hall. And it's a coup. Stella's son was one of the cowardly people, and seeing the knights, he became afraid that he cried and turned to his mother. Stella realized that the fact that the knights, who had remained neutral until now, had started to act was absolute proof. And if the knights had truly decided to support Calix, there was nothing more she could do. Calix asked Russell if he happened to know what punishment awaits a nobleman who tries to kill the direct heir of a noble family. Russell replied that according to the royal noble law, a nobleman would be hanged. Stella realized this was the end, and took her son under her wing and started screaming that Granbane didn't know about anything. She had planned it all herself, and turning to the prince said that even if they weren't related by blood, she was still his mother, and asking him now to have mercy on him. Calix started laughing and asked if it was true, and asked Lyra too, "Is it true?" Lyra replied that when she was tasked by the Countess to kill the prince, Prince Granbane was with them. Stella was completely broken, realizing that her son was going to die too, and started denying it anyway, saying it was bullshit. Lyra knew for a fact that it wasn't true, but no one would believe her anymore. And unfortunately, the person who tried to commit the murder turned out to be a common coward. And Calix realized and saw that the end of his first fox hunt had come. Calix looked at this picture at this moment and was pleased with himself, for Stella lay before his feet and was bound by the knights. But Granbane slapped his hands on the table and turned to Calix. The prince was shocked. He gathered his strength and began to speak. Stella yelled to her son not to do anything, but the prince turned around and saw Granbane walking towards him. Granbane knew exactly what he was doing and got down on one knee in front of the prince. Those present were simply shocked at this turn of events. Granbane turned to the prince and said that he would accept any punishment, but only in return asking him to forgive his mother. Stella didn't realize what her son was doing, and started yelling at him to go back to his seat. Those present began to say that this was too much, and the second prince even got down on his knees. But the second part thought that the second prince was honorable. He kneeled down to protect his mother. But Calix suddenly felt that the direction of the wind had changed, and now everyone thinks as if he is already a criminal, and thought that Granbane was serious about achieving just that. But accepting that, he said he understood him, because he's worried about his mother, that there's nothing he can do. And now if Granbane would plead guilty, he would commute her sentence. And after his confession, he will try to negotiate with the deputy earl to have the death sentence lifted. But let the second prince have it in mind. He cannot change what will be said here, and he must be choosy in what he says. Granbane began to say that Stella began to shout that she was protesting, and asked her son, What is he doing? And let him not say anything unnecessary. But next, Stella moved on to Calix and said that though he was not her own son, let him not dare to order an elder. Those present still couldn't understand the gravity of the situation, and even though he had tried to kill Prince Calix, Gidson saw that the wind of doubt had finally changed, so why was she making unnecessary movements? Stella was still screaming and begging the prince to listen to her, but the count told the knights to arrest the criminals. The knights heard the order and started to suppress Stella, but she asked them to stop, and how dare they even act so rudely? Granbane turned around and saw with his own eyes as they put a clap in her mother's mouth to stop her from screaming. Calix turned to the second prince and said that now they could continue their conversation. And would he admit to trying to poison? Granbane made up his mind and replied that he would confess. But the prince realized that the little boy was trying to pander to him. And did Granbane really believe so much in his own pathetic appearance? And the prince said in front of everyone that since the second prince had admitted his guilt, that the magical scroll of earth memory that could tarnish the honor of the family would not be used, and since he confessed before the evidence was made public, his sentence would be commuted. And to truly make sure that the sinner repents, let him personally seal his monocore right now. It was previously stated that the kingdom of doom is a land of knights, representing a strict class society. The entire kingdom is divided into nobles, knights, commoners, and slaves. The only way to rise to manhood and become a knight is to use mana to strengthen your body. Sealing the mana core in this world is called a social death penalty by many. Granbane was shocked at the prince's order and thought, what should he do now? Stella tried to tell him something but couldn't and just mooed. He realized that if he didn't seal his own mana core, his mother's sins would be exposed, which means the gallows awaits her, and he's not willing to let that happen. Stella tried to tell him, but the gag prevented her. In her mind, she begged her son not to do it. After all, sealing the core is a death sentence for all nobles. Granbane made up his mind and told the prince to promise in front of everyone that he would surely commute his mother's sentence. Russell replied that he would honor his request in that case. Granbane took the record in his mouth and said he would now begin. The recording itself did everything for him, for it sealed the mana forever. Immediately he began to feel a great pain in his stomach, for everything inside him was burning. Stella was asking her son at this moment not to do this and to stop. After all, if the core was sealed, even a great master would not be able to restore it, and his future would be jeopardized. But Granbane wasn't willing to stop, and did everything for his mother. After he finished, half of the recording cut off, and Calix looked at it all and saw the second prince lose his future due to his mother's mistakes. The core inside the second prince began to slowly fade away and become smaller and smaller. Everyone looked at this and realized that this is the mana core and it is sealed. But Stella, at this moment, was lamenting this act. Granbane was surprised, for it turned out to be not as painful as he thought. And now his mother's life was in no danger. Stella, too, realized that it was all over, and he was still so naive. Granbane told his mother not to worry. He still wanted to be an artist. Stella was so angry with Calix that she clenched the gag with her teeth until it bled, and then she ripped off her chains and started screaming at Calix that she would curse him for the rest of her life. How dare he do this to her son? Calix realized that a man without mana would be able to climb up to Class 3 at best, and if he was lucky, reach Lyra's level. Granbane walked over to his mother and tried to reassure her, but the prince was starting to feel like some kind of rotten person, having killed the little girl's future, but immediately began to deny, embracing himself that he was just a game character, and if he showed even the slightest bit of pity, it would be sure to play tricks on him. Russell saw the prince's face and thought, what is going on with him? But the prince knew that the boat he had gotten himself into could not be turned back. He told Russell that this was great, and it was time to deal with the others. Russell immediately turned to Countess Stella and Prince Granbind and told them that they were under arrest pending the outcome of the investigation, and locked them up in the dungeon immediately. And from now on, these two are forbidden to have any contact with anyone. Calix turned around and took one last look as they were tied up and sent out of here. Next, Russell turned to Treasurer Gidlos and said that he was accused of leaking and distributing secret financial documents, and he is removed from his position and detained for further instructions, and arrest the sinner immediately. The knights immediately tied him up and began dragging him to the dungeon, but Gidlos shouted that he was innocent and let them release him. He started calling the knights stupid. And how dare they touch him with their filthy hands? The knight didn't like it, and without thinking, he knocked the old man out with a single blow. Calix saw this and realized that in the future, knights should not be angry. The others started to think they were going to get arrested too. But one of them began to say that at any rate, Prince Calix had no rank or support. But however, Sir Russell is waiting for his instructions. And it seems that all the knights are now on the prince's side. And that means only one thing. The question of succession is closed. Viscount Russell has even bowed his head to them all. And that's right, they got a warning from Prince Calix. But Russell didn't stop and turned to the guard commander. The Lord said that his duties are suspended, and he is under arrest until further proceedings, and asks him to refrain from socializing with others, lest any misunderstandings arise. The commander accepted his punishment and replied that he understood and would do as he was asked. But one of the men present suddenly said himself that he was sorry, and bowed down. The man said that because of his carelessness, the sprouts of treachery had not been plucked from the root, and asked the prince to approve his dismissal at his personal request. But Calix saw that Garrett has not only excellent abilities, but also a good reputation among his subordinates, and if he doesn't find the right words now, the headwind might subside. And it was good that he had talked to Russell beforehand. Russell contacted the head of administrative affairs that his resignation request was denied. And here's a list of people involved in the assassination attempt. And all of those listed are terminated and will be removed from their positions shortly. And he will leave it up to him to deal with this problem. And asks him to see to it that it does not interfere with the economic prosperity of their lands. But suddenly, Russell turned to the prince. Calix approached Garrett and said that all people from the financial sector except for 4 employees are to be investigated, and so they would have to appoint a new treasurer to the finance ministry. Garrett asked the prince to be lenient with those who were least culpable, and if none of the high-ranking officials were in their places, they might be in trouble. Calix realized that when it came to money, you had to cooperate with those who could be completely trusted. So he asked Garrett, is he afraid they will suffer losses? Garrett replied that he wasn't, but the prince asked, would they then appreciate his kindness? Or perhaps he had thus decided to insult. Garrett replied that no, they were just a little mistaken. But Calix gave a menacing look and told the Lord that he had already made up his mind. Garrett noticed that the prince did not look at all like his former self. He was no longer that kind child with an innocent soul. The others have already said that if Russell is the symbol of martial arts, then Garrett is the symbol of writing. And even Garrett is trembling before the first prince. And what is even going on with them right now? Calix rejoiced and realized that the entire Shaken County was almost completely his. But the prince immediately opened the characterization window and decided to look up information about Garrett's identity. After reading about everyone slowly and carefully, he smiled and realized that things were about to get even more fun. Calix remembered that Garrett had told him that it would take some time, but these system windows made it so much easier. He began to look for a member of the opposition bloc from those present, and deal with those who had not yet decided on their chosen side as well. Calix looked around and saw that there were so many useless ones, and decided that he would select only those who would survive the fight for loyalty. The counselors were all surprised at Prince Calix's creepy smile, and they were even creeped out. And some were so terrified that they realized they would die at his mere word. But the counselors gathered in one formation and asked the prince to start speaking out about them first. Calix told them to all calm down, and they still had plenty of time. Russell watched them all from behind and tried to recover a bit from their screams and loud voices. And that same night, Calix came to his room and just collapsed on his bed from exhaustion. Calix lay down and said he was so tired, and slowly closed his eyes. But in his head he heard him say before that studying was boring for him. And the days were no different from each other, and he was ordinary, a game that no one could pass, and he suddenly decided on that day to play that game for the first time. And he decided he could be special too, and on that day he was congratulated by the game and was named Master, and he is the first person to pass the game and ascend to the throne of God. When he finished the game he said it's over, and he was so eager to be reborn on the continent of Erin, and if that happened, he would still be the mediocre person he is. But then the talk of the throne of God came to his mind. He remembered that he had gone through the game and ascended it. And when he first ran the game, it was said that he was born into a small and insignificant soul. And in the moment, it brought to his mind that day when lying down, he said he wished to be reborn on the continent of Erin. And now her wish had come true. But Calix fell back onto his pillow and considered that it no longer mattered. And if he ascended the throne again, would he then be able to make another wish? And by all means would he ascend to the throne? After these words, he closed his eyes from exhaustion and fell asleep. The next morning, Calix woke up earlier than usual and looked outside, wondering where he should start. Even though he knows everything about the game, he has never heard of Shaken County. And where is it located? Thought the prince. Calix opened the map in front of him and decided to figure it out. The system suddenly told the prince that he would be rewarded for the sweep, and everything was marked on the map. Calix was surprised by such an assignment. He immediately realized it was a treasure map. And there's all the dungeon ruins, terrain, and even secret locations that exist in the hero's destiny are staged here, and an obvious bonus that no one knew about, for the one who was able to complete this game. And the markings on the map are so clearly displayed. And there's even information here that he didn't know before. Calix lay back on his couch and spoke out of shock that everything was easy, but he suddenly wondered, what year is it? And looking at the imperial calendar, he saw that it was the year 289. But the fate of the heroes began in the year 294, and he was in Shaken County, which he knew nothing at all about. The prince wondered if this meant that the territory he had spent so much effort to conquer was destined to disappear in 5 years. He became angry and asked why this was so. After all, according to Russell, it was only their financial situation that was somewhat lame, and perhaps that was the reason why there was no way to hire a normal maid who wouldn't want to kill him. Calix suddenly decided that he needed to look through the financial situation window immediately. But suddenly he covered his ears and asked what was wrong. But seeing his eyes, he was shocked at what he saw. He saw the income and thought that maybe he should just take the rest of the money and get out. But realized that was a bullshit idea because he wouldn't be able to run off with the land, and he'd still have to find a way to make money. And land should only be inherited by the owner's relatives, and it would be a waste to throw away the land the county has worked so hard to get. So now he'd better delve into his family's financial situation. And the tax received from farmland is even higher than in other territories, although the difference is not that big. But the problem is, last year they temporarily raised the defense budget, and so they're still in a lot of debt. The sun was already setting outside the window, and Calix was looking at all the documents and suddenly decided to leave them and said that he was tired. I mean, there's 10 years of data here, and the first problem is that the Gorda Plateau has stopped trade and the desert kingdom of Madroa. There's nothing that can be done about that. And because of the cessation of trade between the countries, the tariffs went down. Calix wondered and thought with anger, where did they borrow such a huge amount of money? They paid more in interest on the debt than they collected from taxes in a year. And now the deeper he dives into this whole situation, the more debt he digs up, and he needs some useful information. Suddenly looking around, he fixated on the word information. And come to think of it, in the underground jail is now rotting the main piggy bank of the county. Calix headed straight for the prison and planned that if he asked around Gidlam, he might be able to get some useful information. A guard met the prince and greeted him. Calix asked him if he could take him to Gidlos's prison cell. The prince immediately covered his nose at the disgusting odor, all because of the lack of sewer cleaning. The guard said suddenly that he couldn't believe Prince Calix had come here. Calix looked around and saw that behind the bars sat the man in charge of security, and from the looks of it, he does not intend to obey weaklings. However, suddenly he stopped and saw something strange. The guard was also surprised and turned to the prince. Calix realized that the head of security had some tendencies, and if any of the sinners he captured were falsely accused, Calix decided to offer him that would give him a chance to prove his innocence, and asked the lad what he would say to that. The lad replied that it made sense. But Prince said it's worth a thorough reinvestigation to keep a criminal out of jail, and that's why he thinks he should leave it up to him, the head of security. The guy replied that he understood the assignment and everything would be done. Calix saw that the guy had set up the previous head of security so easily, and now he's listening to him. Maybe he's trying to suck up to him, but on the whole, it doesn't matter. Let the guy use the weirdo any way he wants, and told him that he's still a young man, so the guard needs to be careful when he calls him anything other than Prince. The kid realized his mistake and apologized to the prince. Calix at this point felt that this guy was not so different from the officials he despises so much. The prince told him to relax and showed him Gidlos's cell. The guard replied that they were already there. Gidlos saw the prince and said he couldn't eat that slop, and it wouldn't be long before he was released. Calix walked up to the cell and asked, "Who's the one who's going to release him? Or is he planning on just escaping from prison?" Gidlos replied to the prince that he was waiting for him. And did the prince really come to return the favor he owed him? Did Calix ask him what he was talking about and call him a weirdo? And what was it that he owed him? Gidlos needs to find a new, stronger rope to hang himself with, or he will wish he had done it sooner. Gidlos replied that even though he's in this position now, he's been the Shaken County treasurer for over 20 years, and thinks he has a clue as to why the prince wanted to visit the head treasurer. Calix told the giddy man that he was the chief treasurer. Gidlos smiled in return and asked the prince if he wanted to know about the county's massive debt. Calix got angry and thought he was a fucking loon who didn't realize his position. But Calix decided to move on to other methods and asked the guard, "Is there a torture chamber here?" The guard replied, "Yes," and ordered him to call the torturer immediately. The guard was surprised and asked the prince, "Does he really want to use it?" The prince showed his angry face and clarified to him, "Does it look like all this is a joke?" He asked him the question, and it doesn't look like a joke at all. The guard had never received so many insults before and ran back that he would do it all now. Calix realized that because he was still a toddler, the guard had allowed himself to be relaxed. However, he now had the ultimate authority in these lands, and Gidlos was shocked that the guard went after the torturer and he's screwed. Calix told him that he didn't think people like Gidlos were that patient, and let him try not to get hammered in the first minute. The prince began to laugh suddenly and told the old man that he liked the look of him, and could he change hanging to a slow death especially for him? Gidlos was in a panic at such terrible words, and the prince's eye made him uncomfortable somehow. Gidlos was scared and asked the prince to keep him alive. He absolutely had useful information for him, and Calix realized that if it's some bullshit, as drink would test him to death. He asked the old man if the information was useful. "Let him spill it, Bill." Gidlos replied that all the debts of Shaken County are in the hands of a merchant named Gerard Milkus. He is in charge of the Koshurin family's secret vault. The Viscounty of Koshurin used Gerard to steal mining taxes and also not pay the tax. Calix asked, "So what of it?" Gidson replied that if they reported his person to the royal family, they wouldn't have to pay the debt. Calix asked, what if he sold his rights to repay the debt at a low price before he was arrested? And for example, sell them to the Koshurin family. Gidson immediately thought, and he didn't even think about it. But then the guard came in and told the prince that he had brought him. He's the best in the whole county, the master of torture. Gidson got scared and started screaming in fear for them not to do it, and started begging the prince. The prisoner decided to lay it all out, and said that the captain of the Koshurin family's fund that Gerard was running should exceed at least 100,000 gold. But the torture master immediately entered the cell and grabbed the prisoner. He, out of fear, began to tell everything as it was. Gidson asked the prince to stop, and said he knew where the secret vault of Gerard Milkus was. The prince asked him with surprise, "Secret?" and said it was too noisy. And the guard and the torture master pinned him to the ground. Gidson told the prince he wasn't lying, and it was all thanks to his years of experience as chief treasurer. The prince pressed his foot to his face and told him to answer better. How does he know the location of his secret vault? Gidson at this moment only felt pain. The prince immediately ordered his men to begin the process. Observing this, the prince said that the first to go would be the finger. Gidson replied that he swore he was telling the truth, and one day he tried to steal money from this vault but failed. But the prince realized the trick and asked, it wasn't that he was going to steal it, was it? The treasurer replied that if he didn't pay him, he would take the money from his vault. The prince asked the old man, had he allotted the funds to the thief? And how much had he paid him back? The treasurer replied that only 3. The prince, having heard such a purely 300 gold pieces, asked the old man, isn't he a fool? But then the old man said 3,000, not 300. The prince could not believe his ears at that moment and asked him again, and the old man immediately realized that he was finished. But the prince could not stop and was very much angry. The guard noticed this and realized that the prince was so angry that he could only laugh now. And we should just smash that Chamberlain. But Calix said that 3,000 gold sum from taxes, and received by the county for 6 months. Where did he get that kind of money? The treasurer did not know what to say to the prince, but Calix did not calm down and asked if he had robbed the county of its money. The treasurer replied that he had no other choice. If the key to the vault wasn't the magic crystal ball, it would be the only thing he would stop at. Calix asked, "What other magic crystal ball is there?" and have him raise his head immediately and tell it normally. The old man said that he was told that he had to pay 2,500 gold to make a duplicate. Calix immediately thought he could find a clue, so he told the old man that he had been tricked. Kazanche was surprised and asked wonderingly, "Tricked?" The prince replied that most likely the thief and Gerard Milkus knew each other. The old man couldn't believe it and was still trying to cheer himself up, and said that he had seen with his own eyes the entrance to the secret vault, and the way he opened the door with that magic ball, after which he entered. Calix asked him where this place was. The old man replied that it was Gorda's fee. He was blindfolded, so he doesn't know the exact location, but it is definitely in the Gorda Plateau. Calix opened his map and searched for the place, thinking about it. The guard didn't realize at this moment where the prince was looking. Finding the place, Calix immediately swept it up on the map, and seeing the ruins in the place, he thought he could find its exact location. And it looks like he'll have to take care of this matter tightly soon. Immediately afterward, he thought of who might know about Plateau Gorda. He immediately thought of Lyra, who had told him about it. Lyra had said that it was a special unit made up of children with high fighting characters. They undergo extreme training at Camp Plateau, and there they select the best of the best among those who were able to cope with all the training. Kalik thought and immediately told the guard to follow him. The old man was surprised and followed him, asking the prince how he was. Calix left the prison and realized that the piggy bank had embezzled 3,000 gold pieces, and the warden had been bribed by him. And the more he thinks about it, the angrier he gets. And he doesn't like it when he doesn't do anything about it. And Gidlos needs to be kicked. Calix turned to the guard and said that it had come to light that Gidlos had embezzled 3,000 gold pieces. And naturally, the guard didn't know about it, did he? The guard replied to the prince that he had no idea, and he hoped the prince didn't know that he'd gotten the money from Gidlos. But the prince, as he was leaving, said that while he was away, he had heard one interesting thing from the prisoner. The guard already thought the prince knew all about it. But the prince said he was a kind enough fellow, but didn't he think it was too much? And looking at him, he's just annoyed by everything. The guard immediately fell to his knees and started apologizing, and immediately realized that the old man had decided to turn him in while he was running after the torture master. The guard carefully apologized and promised he wouldn't do such a thing again. But when he looked up, he was shocked to see that the prince was no longer here. And he was angry at the old man for deciding to show him what a hellish agony was. But Calix hid behind the well at that moment and watched everything. But suddenly he felt someone standing behind him. He immediately became wary and thought, "Who is this eggplant?" But turning around, he saw a guy in front of him and asked who he was. Calix looked closely at his clothes and recognized him as a Blue Lion Knight. He asked the guy what he needed. The knight replied that his name was Kraut Salomon. So Sir Russell asked him to accompany the prince. Calix immediately applied his gaze and hesitated, but he decided to act differently and opened the window of the knight in front of him. Looking at the characterization, he saw that Kraut was quite a capable fellow. And was there such a name in the fate of heroes? Thought the prince. And he did not recall it. And had he died young? But the fact that this guy's level limit is within 70 means that he could easily be among the top 100 masters on the continent. And besides, people with such a pumped-up martial skill are quite rare. Suddenly, he remembered something. After all, in everyday life, he had the character of a simpleton, but his essence was a demon that knew no mercy. But even the ruler, the Black Prince, couldn't see his face. And it turns out, this guy is the Preacher of Death. Calix began to deny his assumptions and considered it a game. But the Death Preacher had a grim image because of his lean build. Something about this muscle machine didn't look like a squishy guy at all. And on top of that, there's life in his eyes. But that didn't matter for now, the prince decided. He didn't have much information, so he shouldn't worry about it for now. And looking only at his potential, it would be a good idea to make him his own man. Kraut turned to the prince and asked if he was all right. He had called out to him several times already. The prince asked the guy, "Did something happen?" Kraut replied that a merchant named Gerard Milkus was asking to see him. The prince, hearing the familiar name, was just shocked. He immediately remembered the words of the old man who had given him all the money and ended up being cheated. And it turns out it was the piggy bank that the merchant was talking about, and it seems to be getting very interesting. Calix immediately headed over and said they had to go, but thought the guy was stupid with a great physique, that in the future he would become a preacher of death. But unequivocally, that's not going to happen. It can't be true. After all, the guy doesn't look like him. Kraut and the prince arrived home, and after seeing the man in charge, he opened the door and said that the guest was here. Going inside, the prince saw no one. But suddenly a voice came out and said that it welcomed the prince. The guest immediately introduced himself and said that his name was Gera Milkus, and he is a merchant in a small company. Calix replied that he had heard of it, and despite its small scale, it was quite profitable, and if Milkus is indeed a great merchant, he would always welcome him. Milkus smiled and showed the prince that such words caressed his ears. But the prince asked why such a famous merchant decided to visit him today. After all, he has no official credentials. But when it comes to business proposals, wouldn't it be better to negotiate with Deputy Earl Russell? Milkus laughed and replied that he was sure Shakin County would be led by Sir Russell for a very short time. After all, it all rightfully belongs to the direct heir. And in the lands of the Shakin family, there would be no one who would dare to go against the prince's words. Calix replied bluntly that he is still one of the two candidates for the throne, and hoped that Milkus wasn't trying to placate. Milkus smiled and replied that of course not. Isn't the lord too modest? And he heard that the dispute over the succession to the throne had come to an end. Only the official part remained. But Calix had said that their family hadn't made any announcements about it yet. Milkus started to feel tense and apologized and showed that he was an extremely talented merchant. And if he didn't have this kind of information, it would be very troublesome for him to run his business. But Milkus noticed that this little guy was very different from the rumors. Wasn't the prince a naive simpleton, the man thought? And this heir turns out to be cynical and judicious with words. He deliberately hid his true nature. And the child, who has not lived even 20 years, has been deceiving the whole world for more than 10. He just doesn't believe in such things. However, the rumors about his beauty, which makes even men's hearts tremble, are indeed true. And just how much this prince likes him, felt Milkus. But at that moment, Calix saw his strange look and immediately stood up. Calix immediately said that he didn't have much free time, and it was the merchant who requested a private meeting with him. And if he had nothing to say, could he please leave here? Milkus bowed and replied that he apologized, and realized that if things continued like this, all his plans would come to an end, and he needed to calm this guy down by any means necessary. Milkus decided to speak up and said that when he saw the prince for the first time, he was so enchanted by his appearance, which doesn't even come close to the rumors. But Calix didn't really like it and considered it nonchalantly. The prince sat back in his chair and told him to stop the idle chatter and get to the point already. Milkus said he had one thing to do with the prince, and he was here to talk to him about a huge debt he had inherited from the now-deceased Earl Colin. Calix replied that this was the first he had heard of it. And he doesn't know if Milkus knows, but the chief treasurer is currently in the dungeon due to suspicion of murder. The prince was picking his nose at this point and threw out a bug and decided to snap at the merchant. After all, it wouldn't work on him. Milkus had said it was fair, and it had been 5 years, so the prince might not have known about it. And in his head he rejoiced that the moment he had waited so long for had come. A handsome boy falls into despair when he learns that a huge debt hangs over him. And watching such a thing live is the most blissful feeling on earth, Milkus thinks. But the merchant explained that the contract allowed him to demand a lump sum repayment of the principal and the amount accumulated from interest at any time after 3 years from the date of loan approval. Milkus felt that the important thing was to keep his emotions to himself and not to smile, and apologized to the prince, but he still has to pay back the full amount that his family owed within 2 weeks, that is, until the end of the month of the offering. And in the end, the total amount is 60,000 gold pieces. Kraut was shocked to hear such a huge sum. But Calix sat still and reacted to everything loyally. He even thought that Kraut was too noisy. But Milkus was getting very excited as he watched this guy trying to stay calm. Calix turned his head at the guy and saw him thinking, why so much money? But Milkus stood up and asked the merchant if he could extend the time limit a bit. They looked at each other for a long time, and Milkus said he was sorry, but because of the previous earl's passing, his confidence in the county had fallen considerably, and he had wanted to ask for a repayment of the debt a year ago, but he felt it would not be the right thing to do. So now it was the next earl's turn to pay this small debt. Crate was greatly frightened and thought what to do next. But Calix noticed that Milkus had played the goody-goody by informing him 2 weeks before the repayment that the deadline could not be extended. He decided to stand up and said that perhaps the merchant was already aware. The county's annual income exceeds 60,000 gold, and they need not worry about their county not being able to repay the loan. Kraut was shocked at such words and didn't think there was such a thing. Milkus rejoiced and replied that it was wonderful, and it looked like he really didn't have to worry about it, and thought this prince was just naive, and realized that it wasn't an amount that a nobleman not yet connected to power would be able to get, but said that they would soon have a loan agreement with a seal on it, and would never believe that there was anyone so ignorant as to be able to lend this boy such money. And soon this county and all its lands will pass to him. Mikus is all set and says he'll be the first to decline, and is very much looking forward to the moment when he can see such a nice boy kneeling down and begging for forgiveness from the humble merchant. And he has such an elegant face, and could he sell him on the black market, Milkus thought, but began to deny it, and decided he would only enjoy it for his own pleasure. Milkus said goodbye, and wished the prince good luck one last time. But Calix didn't even give any sign of how angry he was and could barely hold it together. And Kraut said that if the amount owed equaled 60,000 gold, and his weekly wage was 2 silver, and they have 53 weeks in a year. But Calix got sick of it all and asked him to stop counting. He's distracted. Kraut asked the prince, wondering why he was so calm. How could anyone stay calm in a situation like this? And if they don't do anything, the county will have all the territory taken away. The prince realized that he couldn't tell the guy that there was a hidden chest in the Gorda Plateau. According to the map, it was located in some ruins. Looking at the map again, he realized everything, and it looked like he would have to go on a journey soon. After all, outside the castle, one can move around safely, but the entire continent of Erin cannot be walked around so easily, and especially in the plateau of Gorda has always been a high level of difficulty, since there are some pretty dangerous monsters dwelling there. And if this place wasn't his only chance, his foot wouldn't be there. Immediately after their meeting, they went outside and Kraut asked the prince who he was going to see. The prince realized that he was heading to someone who probably knows a lot about Plateau Gorda, and this was an assassin who valued his life might become quite useful in the future. The guard was standing guard at this moment, and upon seeing Prince Calix, he immediately became worried. The guard immediately thanked the prince for visiting them, but the prince said he had a few questions for the sinner. And he may not worry, Kraut would go with him. Kraut walked forward and said that this room used to be the official residence of the Gidlos. Once inside, Calix said that it looked nothing like he had envisioned. But suddenly the girl replied that she had changed the interior a bit. That jerk had a bunch of expensive proceeds. Seeing her, Calix got excited and said she looked pretty good. Lyra replied that she wasn't even complaining. Kraut, upon seeing the woman, immediately grabbed his weapon and realized she was dangerous. But Lyra crossed her eyes with the prince and said that he had tricked her. Calix immediately remembered that when he caught her, he tricked her with poison, saying it was deadly. Calix replied to the girl that she guessed it faster than he thought. But Lyra was angry and said that the fact that he had come all this way meant that he still needed her. But what is there to do? She asked. She wasn't going to take orders from the prince anymore. However, if the two of them were alone together and exchanged warm feelings, perhaps she would honor his request. And the prince would have to do a good job, of course. Kraut started to get angry and said that immoral damsel and started to walk towards her. But the prince stopped him and said he was here to give her a chance to survive. Lyra asked in what way. Calix replied that even if he let her go free right now, as soon as she leaves this building, she will be killed immediately. Lyra was shocked and asked, what did that even mean? Calix replied that after recent events, the Viscount's family and the Count's family had become openly feuding. Lyra said that was correct. Not only did the prince turn Viscount's daughter into a laughingstock, but his favorite grandson was actually forced to seal the monocore, so it was only natural. The prince asked her, didn't she realize that she was the witness whose testimony caused all this to happen? Lyra got very scared and asked, is she going to be killed by the Kasharin family? Shouldn't the prince save his witness and cancel his testimony? After all, that was the only way she could clear her name. But Calix asked her, why would he do that? Would Granbane's Monocore then return to normal? So she was also completely ruining their plan to take over Shaken County. The nobleman would not allow an inferior bloodline that interfered with him to live. Lyra had actually seen many die like dogs while serving the nobles' assholes, and she didn't even think that she could suffer the same fate. She was very upset because she was the main part of the Countess's plan. Lyra was so upset that she grabbed a sharp object and attacked the prince, screaming for him to die. But at the last moment, Calix already thought that Kraut would not save him, as he suddenly saw his foot slamming into Lyra's chest and pushing her away. Kraut started screaming that she was a vile murderer, and how dare she attack the prince. Lyra lay on the floor and gathered herself into a lump from the pain. Calix walked over and thanked the knight for protecting him, but he shouldn't have underestimated her. And anyway, she was the one who had helped him become the sole heir. Kraut immediately apologized to the prince. The prince told him not to sweat it. And people often have more negativity towards someone who opened their eyes to their predicament than the person who actually brought them to that state. And asked the knight, why does he think this is so? Because it's easier. And no matter who it was, venting his emotions would make him feel better. But only for this one moment. And considering how attached to life she is, it's not like she's the type to give up easily, right? Lyra replied that that was correct. She's never going to die, and she can't die. Calix got excited and said he could still use her, and if she helps him, he will pledge to protect her from her pursuers, and if she has a family, he'll take care of her too. But Lyra replied that her family would have no part in it. What does he want to take them hostage so she can help him? And he wouldn't see it that way, not on her watch. Calix started laughing and told her to get it right. He wouldn't be sad if she died right now, and assassins like her are ponderous all around. Lyra realized that was right, and she was just another pawn to the nobleman. She asked, if there are so many, so why doesn't he find someone else? Isn't there some reason why he needs her help specifically? Calix replied that firstly, she would save him the time of looking for people, and secondly, he remembered what she said. But Lyra thought about it and said that at any rate, the Shaken family had crossed the line of no return, and more likely than not, one of the two families would come to an end. And it would be in her best interest for that family to be Kosharine. Calix rejoiced and replied that she had finally turned her brain on. But Lyra mentioned that in return he should treat her as a mercenary with a labor contract, not a subordinate. And it annoyed her when she was ordered to do something other than her direct duties. Kraut didn't like all of this and started yelling at her to look the prince in the eye. Lyra raised her hands and asked the knight if he could settle down. Naturally, she would be courteous to her employer. And above all, he is her savior. And he's not trying to be rude to his new friends, is he? And he appreciates and respects the virtues of chivalry, doesn't he? Kraut didn't like that and asked her what kind of friends he and her were still. Lyra immediately walked up to him and looked him in the eye. But Calix said that he had said the other day that the camp where the children of the Kosharin family's Force of Darkness trained, and it was located in the plateau of Gorda. Lyra immediately remembered telling the prince everything she knew, but she started to deny it. But Calix immediately turned to the knight and said he needed a map, where the entire kingdom and the terrain surrounding the territory of the Viscounty of Kosharni would be depicted in detail. But in truth, the prince realized that he was the only one who could see the map in the system window. Kraut replied that there was a huge map hanging in the leisure room in the barracks. Calix, hearing this, immediately rushed to the barracks. Lyra immediately saw that they were some overcharged. Kraut opened the door and told the prince to go through first, but the knight turned around and was shocked, and immediately asked the prince why he was in the back. Calix replied to let him go first. The knight asked the prince, "Does His Majesty not know where the barracks are located?" Calix replied that he knew and told the knight to keep walking, but Kraut started to get indignant and asked how could he. Knights always follow their master. They made it to the barracks for the morning, and Kraut said it was their leisure room. Aaron's continent is a military map, so there will be more detail here than on the civilians. Calix started looking with his eyes on the map for where the Gorda Plateau was, and when he found it, he pointed his finger and said, "This is the place. What do they know about it?" Kraut looked and replied that it was fairly well-known land. It's the area where the Viscounty of Kosharin and the Barony of Erebon fight over land issues. There are also many deposits of high-quality coppery there, but the development of the metal has been delayed due to the conflict. Calix said at once that Baron Erebon was from their family. The knight replied that was correct. But Calix looked closer and asked, "Is this map straight accurate? How much time has passed since the research and recording?" Knight replied that he apologizes and doesn't know. But Lyra said it seems old, but she doesn't notice any serious errors, and she thinks it would be better if they just correct a couple places that have changed recently. Calix turned around and asked her if she was sure she understood what was missing here. Lyra replied that of course she did. She knows the area well because she played there as a child. But Lyra asked what is in the Gorda Plateau? The prince replied that there are ancient ruins there that he is going to explore. Lyra asked with surprise, "Ruins?" Something she didn't recall such a thing. Calix replied that when she was a child, were there places that adults advised her to never go into? Lyra immediately thought after saying that, and remembered that there was such a thing, and she was told that all the time. Lyra said that she was recalling something. But the prince asked them both if they knew when the Kosharin family started training their troops. But Lyra replied that she didn't get the gist of the question. She is a 6th grade graduate. It's been 5 years since she was sent to Shaken County, so somewhere around 15 years. The prince began to question them. When did the territorial dispute between the Kosharin and Erebon families begin? The knight replied that it was around the same time. Lyra at this point touched the knight with her finger and asked, did he realize something? The knight replied that he hadn't yet. Lyra got upset and pretended to be displeased. But the knight didn't like it and started yelling at her, asking, "What's with the cocky attitude? Is she making fun of him?" Lyra replied that it's nothing like that. And why the hell is she calling her cocky? But Calix told them, to prepare a large army, you need a huge amount of money. And in other words, dramatically increasing the size of the armed forces was quite problematic, unless there was an emergency. Lyra asked the prince what was his point. The prince that it was to the fact that they have the treasury stuffed to the brim. But the girl got angry and said she wasn't asking him. The prince immediately said that Kraut was right. However, it should also be noted that at the same time, the Kosharin family had acquired new money, and it probably went to train special forces. And it's already known that these soldiers were sent on various secret missions. And all of this actually happened to Lyra. The girl was just shocked and didn't know why she was the one. But Kraut asked, and what was her secret mission? Lyra asked, what were these means? And what did they have to do with the ruins? Calix replied that usually copper mines are discovered along with silver ores, and copper ore often contains impurities of silver. The knight asked the prince, is he saying that the Viscount's family is engaged in secret silver mining? That's a serious offense. Calix replied that is correct, but let them think about it too. And suppose a silver vein is discovered in their territory. However, according to royal laws, gold and silver mines, wherever they are located, will belong to the royal court. And would they report the discovery? Also, one must consider that they belonged to a noble family. Kraut asked, what about the ruins? Calix replied that he has a rough idea of what the ruins look like there, and it's the perfect place to hide something. And even if he told them the truth, they wouldn't believe him. It's not like he's ever left the castle. Lyra asked, what does this have to do with them? Is he planning to start a war to take control of these silver gifts? And she wasn't sure if Shaken County possessed such a huge army. The knight cried and knew it was sad to admit it, but she was damn right. But Lyra said that in any case, the undeclared silver mines are illegal, even if they can get hold of them during the war. The other side would just report it to the royal court. And then the whole thing would be meaningless. And what if they report it first? Calix replied that there would be no benefit. The territory is on the verge of bankruptcy, so the county needs the money. Lyra asked him, what is he going to do? Calix replied that they probably have a lot of money that they have been saving so diligently up to this point. It's money earned illegally, so they won't be able to sue anyone if they steal it, right? The knight replied that it makes sense. That same night, Calix went out to the courtyard and gathered a group of people. But then Russell came up and asked, would he really go with this 2-year-old? After all, the plateau of Gorda is an extremely nasty place, and he asks the prince to be careful. If he takes too much risk, he's bound to run into problems he can't handle. And maybe he'll change his mind while he's still here? Calix wondered, and immediately felt that the Lord had now told him as a grandfather, worried about his grandson. Calix replied that it would be 100 times easier if he went with him, and I'm sure they certainly wouldn't have been offended by anyone. However, if people like Kraut could grow up on their own, they would be able to get closer to their common goals even faster. The knight heard such nice words and rejoiced, and the prince went on to say that he doubted that leaving the county to the two of them in such an unstable time would work out into something good. It was too great a risk. Russell replied that he understood. He was thinking too superficially, and wished the prince good luck on his journey. But next he moved on to the knight and started yelling and threatened to serve the prince very well. And if even the slightest scratch appeared on his body, he would tear him apart. Kraut replied that there was no need to worry, and he can count on it. Russell punched Knight and told him to be a little more serious. Kraut realized the mistake and apologized. Russell decided to admonish the fighters as well, and let them know that the prince's wounds were not yet healed. Regardless, he planned this trek for the sake of his land and family, and asks them to follow him faithfully. Calix looked closely and didn't see a single soldier who loved or at least respected his suicidal slave master. And during the journey it would be necessary to somehow increase their loyalty to him. But this passage was very difficult, and to get out unnoticed, they had to go down into the tunnel. The knight decided to go first and check the situation inside, and asked the prince to be careful. Calix replied that he accepted everything. Going down, the knight said that the passage here is quite long, so they will be walking for a long time. It is an underground path leading outside the castle. Shining his light forward, he illuminated his path. Calix was so confident that he immediately said it was time to go. Walking a long way, finally Kraut said it's here and they have arrived. Calix was so exhausted he couldn't even open his mouth. Crate walked up to the iron door and said hard, but the prince felt that this body was too weak and thought he would at least make it through this way somehow. The knight immediately afterward decided to help the prince and told him to take his hand. The prince gave his hand, and the knight lifted him up with an ease that even he himself was shocked. Upon opening the secret entrance, Calix was surprised and asked, "Where are they?" Kraut replied that it was an abandoned watermill, and the way out of here. Calix stepped outside and was greatly surprised to be so prepared. Kraut immediately ordered that everyone get ready, and asked the prince to get on the wagon. But Calix didn't like that and immediately told him that he shouldn't call him prince from now on. He plans to go into enemy territory, and the knight that he wants to be recognized as a man of the shaken family, and henceforth he will be a young lord. The knight replied that he understood, and it won't happen again. The prince realized that just dressing in the clothes of merchants would not look natural. These people need more practice. Calix turned to the knight and clarified what he had previously been instructed to do. Was it ready? Kraut replied that it was, but would he really have to walk around in those horrible-smelling clothes? Calix told him that since he didn't want this one, would he be comfortable wearing the one with his luggage in it? Or did he think it would be better for him to play the part of Lyra's husband? Kraut was immediately startled and replied that he didn't need to, and he would do it himself. And he can't have a female assassin sitting next to him. The people around them, hearing such words, immediately stopped in fright and looked at Lyra. Calix saw this and thought he was a moron and told him not to talk too much. Kraut walked forward and decided not to think about it, and as if he was lying, and holding out his hand to the lady, he asked for them to go. But Lyra turned out to be angry and asked, "Who else is the lady? And no need to piss her off," and with a wave of her hand called him a slave. Calix immediately saw that this was the end of the relationship between servants. After all, if the characters are compatible with each other, then synergy can be achieved. If it's the other way around, they will constantly be in conflict. In the end, one of them will either die or simply leave the master at will, or perhaps the fate of the heroes is more unusual than he thought. God or someone else created it while studying the real world, and now he hopes Lyra realizes she has to prove her usefulness to everyone on her own. But should she get a little help, the prince thought? Suddenly, Kraut came up and said that everything was ready. Calix replied that it was perfect, and while the sun was still up, they should get as far away from the castle as possible. Kraut stepped in front of everyone, and raising his lantern, he let them know it was time to move out. The prince's journey was a thorny one. There was only one road, with many enemies and beasts, but there were some glorious moments along the way as they sat by the fire and thought out their plan. And beyond that, they passed through a small town, where Caruth stopped to buy some fruits and vegetables. In the evening, Caruth told the prince that the village they passed through today was the last peaceful point. Calix was so tired that he dared to tell the knight to order the others to remove their disguises and begin full-scale preparations for tomorrow's battle. The knight replied that he understood and immediately ran to carry out the order given. For the morning, Calix gathered everything behind him and said that now the fun would begin. And slowly, they set out again on a journey in which they were no longer hiding from the rest of the eyes. Suddenly, Kraut said that the scout they sent out had returned. The prince replied that this was excellent. The scout told the elder knight that there was a pack of forest snow monsters ahead. Kraut was surprised and asked how many were there. The scout replied that there were about 5. Kraut immediately began to think how it would be best to act. But Calix touched him with his finger and told him to take it in his arms. He wishes to see everything with his own eyes. Kraut suddenly smiled and grabbed the prince in his arms and climbed up the tree with him and showed him everything. Calix took a closer look and said, there they were. At this point, the monsters were hibernating after a stormy night, but suddenly their eyes suddenly lit up. Kraut said, these are not bad monsters. They would be a pain to deal with. Calix agreed and asked what the plan was. The knight replied that first they would block the escape routes with fire arrows, but suddenly the prince asked him to stop, and asked the knight, is he going to set them on fire? Is he out of his mind? Kraut replied to the young lord that he was sorry, but the lives of his subordinates were at stake, and you can't gamble with people's lives without even confirming your theory. And he realized that no one on the continent of Erin knew more about monsters than him, but there was no way to convince him of the knowledge. Kraut lifted the prince up and said that he would not set fire to it, but would make his own practical plan. And the prince realized that even if he could convince Kraut, he didn't know if the others would agree. Caruth had told the Blue Lion Knights that he was going to tell them their plan. The prince began to listen to their thoughts on this and was greatly angered by it. He began to think, what is this even? This isn't even a strategy. And isn't this just a presentation of duties to each person? After all, if he didn't prove his abilities, he wouldn't be an authority to them. And he'll probably just be a burden that way, the prince thought. Immediately afterward, he heard the main leaders tell him to start training, and the prince wished to prove his abilities to them so that they would not consider him a burden. But suddenly turning his head, he saw Lyra, who wanted to tell him something. She sat down next to the protagonist and bluntly explained that this plan would fail. After all, there is a chance that none of the participants of the mission will survive. And naturally, that's only if the prince doesn't risk his life to save these people. The prince grumbled and understood her words, even without her. But Lyra wondered why he was silent. But the prince revealed that he wasn't, and pondered on how to overcome this crisis and take the reins of his people into his own hands. He decided to share it with her and told her that he had an idea, and now he would tell her all about it. But Lyra began to resent it, and gave him the information that snow monsters have a very strong attachment to children, and once the battle begins, protecting the cubs becomes their top priority. Regardless of whether the battle situation is favorable or unfavorable, the females run away with their cubs and the males buy them time. And by hiding their child in a hiding place, they will retaliate until the moment there is not a wet spot left of their enemy. Calix thought about it and felt pissed off by the whole thing. He decided to ask the girl as well what she thought about it. Lyra was shocked at such a question, and replied that she had something she wanted to check out first. In fact, their goal wasn't to destroy the monsters after all, but just to pass through here without obstacles. Calix replied that she had the right idea. They just needed to sneak further in. And then Lyra let him know that she had a way, and they would feel that their hiding place wasn't so safe. Right now, there are 5 individuals blocking the path they're traveling on. And after that idiot's attack, another squad needs to be sent in to make a ruckus around the hideout where the females and children are. And even if it's temporary, but all the monsters will retreat to their hideouts. And if they don't miss the moment and use the team together, their Elisgelvgine forces will be able to pass through safely. Calix was actually thinking about that strategy too. But let her know there was one nuance, and asked her directly who would do it. Who would find the hiding place and attack it? And to save his children, the angry snow monster goes crazy and chases the enemy to the other side of the world. Even if the prince realized that it was just suicide, he didn't know who would go for such a thing. Just as suddenly, Lyra pointed at herself and decided to do it. The prince looked at her with surprise and didn't even realize that she would risk her life. Lyra explained that her plan had originally called for it, but the prince didn't realize if she had the temptation of a siren. The girl was shocked by such a question and couldn't understand where she could have it from. But the guy answered her that it was easy. There was no way she would have agreed to a mission where she could die so easily. And these monsters have a better sense of smell than a dog. That's why this herb is needed to screw them over. The girl showed him that she has been following him for a long time already, but lately her opinion of him has changed a lot. And he did not look like that child at all, and such a sudden cough she heard from him and decided to ask how his health was. The prince replied that all was well with him, and the plan was at least definitely better than before. Lyra was so confident that she asked him not to worry. She had been playing here since she was 8 years old, and to her, this was just a regular playground. Prin wondered what purpose she was trying so hard for him. The girl made no secret of it, and replied that if the Shaken family was destroyed, she would be in danger. Calix knew he couldn't be skeptical of those words, but there was no reason not to believe them either. Calix agreed with her and saw that it was hard to get others to recognize her accomplishments, and could he have confidence in her that she could handle it? The girl immediately booted herself up after saying that, but the prince stood up, and before she left, he decided to ask her something. The girl was curious. She even wondered what he wanted to ask her. Calix walked up to her and, pointing his finger, told her to look in the direction of the finger. He let her know that when the snowmen attacked, there would always be 1 or 2 more of them than there were in front of her. And what could she say to that? The girl thought for a moment and replied that they would attack a group of knights from behind. The prince said that was correct, and that's usually how they do it. Right after that, he showed her 2 more places and asked her what she thought of these places. The girl took a closer look and replied that she strongly believed that there was definitely something there, and probably a village of goblins, and those creatures are the snowmen's favorite food. Calix was pleased and thanked her for the useful information. After all, now it would be even easier to figure it out. The prince didn't really believe that it would be possible to stop the guys from the snow monster nest and the guys behind her, and they don't have enough strength, and it's hard to convince them, and he probably wouldn't dare to go there. Lyra bowed back and let her know to continue to be addressed. She was already thinking in her head that the prince would have the knights defend the place, but the prince came before her and made it clear that he had a couple more requests. At that moment, Kraut saw his prince, who was chatting very curiously to the very harmful woman, and he actually became very curious as to what they were agreeing with each other about. But he was at such a long distance that he did not understand even half of the words and tried to gather words from the movements of their lips. It didn't take long for the communication to last as Lyra started to smile and said that sounded like fun. But Calix froze in the moment and only looked at her eyes, and Lyra touched the prince's face and began to whisper with her lips. It was so real that Calix couldn't even move his lips, and thought in his mind wondering what this was happening to him. Calix closed his eyes and came to his senses and opened them. He heard Lyra say it was trash. The boy looked closer and saw that there was a leaf on her hands, and she said it was on him. The prince calmed down, realizing that it was just regular trash. And now he begins to understand the feelings of people who risk their lives on autograph sessions of their favorite idols. But all this time, Kraut didn't leave them unattended, and approaching Prince decided to ask if they needed his help. Calix was so angry that he showed his unperturbed face and made it clear that he didn't need it. But the knight proved to be persistent and asked if he was sure. But then Calix got an idea in his head and asked him to prepare armor for Lyra, and he gave her a special assignment. And not to worry just in case she runs away on the way. It's fine. The knight got curious and asked the guys if he could find out what the mission was. Truth be told, he still didn't trust her very much. The prince smiled and replied to trust him. They're all in the same boat here. The knight said through indignation that this was the first and last time he would trust her. But Lyra had already approached them in the meantime and made it clear that he had taken the armor beforehand without permission, and therefore he shouldn't bother. But the picture turned out much better than the guys had imagined. After all, seeing her figure simply remained with open mouths. People also heard their cries and stopped to make sure that all is well. But they saw the girl's magnificent beauty. Kraut even blushed with surprise, for he could not put 2 words together. Lyra put on her armor and was ready for the mission, and people thought she was very cool and chic at that moment. The girl decided to act smart, and opening a jar of herbs, she smeared it on her face. Karut realized that she was planning to hide her scent with this ointment. He even covered his nose from such a horrible stench, and feels like his nose is about to fall off, and wishes for this mission to be over quickly. But Calix supposed her look had changed. Even though there's a lot of noise and commotion around, she doesn't care at all. The girl started checking her cold weapons to make sure everything was up to par. And the prince realized while doing so that there was no need to worry. Lyra threw on her robes and walked over to the prince and said she could start. The prince gave her the okay to proceed, and suggested she take some soldiers with her. The girl replied that she was fine. They wouldn't listen to her anyway. The guy thought about her words and agreed. Lyra immediately set off on the task and moved through the trees with her speed. Kraut then gave orders to the squad that they were moving out as well. On the way, Kraut got trapped in a trap in which monsters surrounded them. So he decided that he would kill them all with one blow. He started to analyze the side of the wind and felt that it was heading towards the snow monster's nest, and Lyra was heading in the opposite direction. And Calyx heard this and realized that he wouldn't learn anything from watching her. Kraut didn't waste any more time and proceeded with his plan to attack the snow monster from the sky. But the monster was so sensitive that he sensed his stay behind the light of the wind, and before he could react, he was struck in the face. But Kraut immediately realized that it was weak for his blow, and Calyx looked at it from afar and thought he was already an idiot. After all, if he was going to start with a surprise attack, he had to aim for vital points with his first strike, and knew that he had to use the cut immediately. But Kraut was lost at this moment and didn't know how he should proceed. While the monster was already flying at him with its huge fist, the dust around them rose several meters from such a hard blow, but Karut was able to block the attack and survived. Calyx was happy after that and felt that watching a real battle live was much more interesting, and strikingly different from the fights he was used to watching through a screen. The monster began to resent and beat his chest to show his strength, but it was much worse than that, because with such shouts he called his friends for help. The monsters heard him and immediately headed towards him. Calyx realized that things were very bad, and thought that the arson plan might not have been so bad. But Kraut reacted quickly and called for help from the Blue Lion Knights. The prince didn't even realize what was going on at first. But suddenly, the man in front of him said hello, and the knight introduced himself and said he was Convoy Thomas. And standing next to him is Alba. Thomas asked the prince not to go anywhere and to stay behind them all the time. The monsters came running at such a tremendous speed that they immediately flew at the knights with their huge fists. The knights felt very thin after such a huge blow. But Kraut saw this and decided to help them and channeled his energy into his sword. He turned out to be much stronger than expected. After gaining one speed, he jumped into the sky to finish what he started, and with his energy, he headed towards the monster. Seeing this bright light, the monster just didn't know what to do, and the knight used his thunder arrow. The arrow traveled with great speed through several trees and destroyed a lot of things behind it. The backlash from the arrow was so powerful that Calyx even moved from his seat, as the energy had a strong effect on his human body. A strong wind blew and dust flew around, and Kraut's feet were the first to be seen. Immediately afterward, a huge monster fell in front of him, which he felled with a single blow. Calyx was also shocked that the knight had smashed him, and why was he smiling on the battlefield? Let him go help the others immediately. Kraut turned around, and seeing the battlefield as his allies fought, he immediately let them know to tolerate his arrival. The rest of the knights were just trying to finish off the monsters, but the monsters were stronger. Alba was in danger at this point and lost his sword from his hands. The monster saw this and immediately set out to kill him. Alba was so frightened that he was ready to say goodbye to his life. But at that moment, Kraut arrived and immediately, without thinking, with 2 feet, flew into the monster's face. He wasted no time and began shouting to the knight to pick up his sword. Alba came to his senses and, picking up his sword, thanked the captain for his rescue. But Kraut was sorry that he wouldn't be able to have a long series of blows. But Alba was starting to feel threatened again. But Thomas ran up and saved his ally by cutting off the monster's arm. Thomas realized after his blow that they're pretty damn resilient, and even this old guy is tougher than he thought. But Thomas was not left out again, and engaged in another battle with the monster. And when he scouted the situation, he definitely saw 8 of them. But there were only 7. But it didn't matter to him anymore, because suddenly a huge and ferocious monster stood in front of him. Kraut tried to get to the battlefield and saw that the boogeyman was targeting the prince. Kraut started yelling at the prince to get out of there. Alba stood up for the prince and told him to stay behind him. Thomas decided to do something different and used a long-range attack on the monster and shouted that he would not give him the prince. The monster felt a bright light in front of his eyes, but decided not to run away and take everything on his body. Alba was ready to give his life for the prince, and the bright light from the captain's attack blinded his eyes. Calix stood up and asked the knight, "Did he do it?" But the dust still stood on the battlefield and prevented him from seeing the result of the attack. Then suddenly a huge hand suddenly emerged from the dust and immediately reached for Alba. But Alba didn't even have time to react before he felt a strong pain in his chest and a strong flow of wind. The blow was so strong that the prince did not even notice how a human body flew next to him. But that's when Thomas came running in and told the prince that it was bloody dangerous here, and asks him not to move away. But suddenly Kraut came running in and immediately started attacking the monster to keep it from getting close to the prince. Thomas was looking at this beautiful moment and didn't see it coming. Calix took a knee and told Thomas to run over there and help the captain deal with that monster, and that would obviously give them a better chance of survival. But Thomas replied that he had to disagree, and if he could hold out a little longer. Calix interrupted him and asked the knight if he could handle saying that, and if he could handle it, surely someone would come to their aid. And Thomas let him think about it carefully. And if the soldiers fell, he would have to deal with 2 snow monsters alone, and that could put him in even more danger. Thomas remembered that Captain Kraut had ordered him not to take a step away from the prince. But Calix was angry and asked Thomas how dare he disobey his master's order. Thomas realized that he too was a knight, and a knight's first duty is to obey his lord's orders. Thomas made up his mind and, putting his sword to his heart, replied that he would do his will, and he would fight for his lord. Calix thought this was a very courageous decision, and that Thomas agreed to it. But Calix went further into the search, and seeing his knight's leg, he immediately ran up. Calix saw the body and immediately began to shout the name, "Adita!" But looking closer, he saw that the knight had lost his arm. The prince approached him and asked him to stay conscious, and he would stop his bleeding now. He lifted his head and started pouring elixir down his throat, and asked God for the boy to survive, and saw that Alba was able to swallow, but his stomach was swollen and apparently bleeding internally. He stood up and realized that a potion of such a low grade would not work, and needed to find a healer as soon as possible. And if he didn't, he would have to give him a mid-level potion. He picked up his sword and asked for Alba to live. Alba watched the prince try to save his life and slowly saw him off with his eyes. Calix made his way into the forest and realized that Lyra was right. This was actually the goblin village, and right now the snow monsters were having quite a feast. The monster was so happy that he just threw goblins in his stomach, but after that, the monster was so full that he started to release gas from his mouth and drooled all over Calix. Calix looked around and saw that the monster was gone, and wiping the drool from his face felt like he might die. He was suddenly very scared all of a sudden, and his plan is perfect. Lyra has set a trap so he won't get hurt. But this wasn't his world where he just pushed buttons and watched what would happen. But his body odor was so strong that the monster could smell it. He remembered Alba's body and decided that he could and would not die, and would not let his knight die. Calix made up his mind and, coming out of hiding, started shouting to the monster that he was here, and lastly telling it to enjoy the last few minutes of its life. Calix got so close to the monster that he confidently said that this was it. Without thinking long, he found the very trap, and pulling the rope, the monster was shot in the back with sharp arrows. The arrows were so sharp that the monster started screaming in pain at the top of his voice. The monster couldn't stand the pain of the arrows and died on the spot. But it was more complicated than that. The first monster was followed by another monster, which attacked the prince. Calix reacted in time and dodged the monster's blow. The blow was so strong that the tree shattered into 2 pieces. Calix ran off to the side and found the next trap. Pulling the rope, the trap triggered and the sharp rod simply tied the monster up. The prince realized that if one used a shoulder rose and lubricated the thorns with Siren's temptation, most monsters could probably be caught easily enough. Lyra only used this mixture to get rid of her own body odor, but the Siren temptation also has another great effect of putting them to sleep. Calix immediately realized that everything had gone right. Raising his sword, he immediately stuck it into the monster's head, and he could clearly feel the sword piercing his flesh. But when he saw the blood, he began to vomit violently, and he thought he wouldn't know such emotions until the first time he killed a human being. But he had stolen the life of a simple living being with his own hands. But everything started to piss him off, and the prince got so angry that he started cutting this monster into small pieces, and he thinks his strength is on the level of a 4th-class knight. so he's good that he was able to handle him. But he was so happy with his victory that he didn't even notice the goblin coming at him. But his eyes began to glow, and he immediately saw a bright flash in front of him. He immediately saw Alba's body flying at him. Opening his eyes, he saw a huge monster in front of him. But turning his head to the side, he realized that Alba would no longer live. After all, that monster had just put a hole in his chest. Calix became even more angry and immediately rushed at the monster, screaming to be damned. He started throwing crushing blows, but the monster was faster and dodged with ease. But then the monster picked up the moment and tried to retaliate. But the prince managed to move aside in time to prevent his weapon from touching him. As he got on all fours, he realized that he was lucky that the monster was short-handed, but felt that his body was too weak. So much strength was wasted with every swing of his sword. But his attack distance was still higher than the monster. Even if you combine the length of his arm with the length of his dagger, it would be somewhere around 50-60 centimeters. But if you compare it to his working radius, it's still twice as much as this little bugger. And as long as the monster doesn't get hit, it'll be fine. He has a chance to win. Raising his head, he saw that the monster was already approaching him. But Calix didn't step aside and immediately swung his sword. Eventually, the attack reached the monster, but only hit his ear, which he immediately lost. The monster did not give up and continued his attack. Calix decided he didn't have time to dodge, so he immediately fell to the ground and pushed himself off the ground with his feet. He saw that his shoulder was nearly disintegrated, and it was a very good thing he was a nimble fellow. After that, he got to his feet once more and decided to finish this monster off, confidently holding his sword in his hands and started swinging with it left and right to somehow catch the monster. Eventually, the monster just fell to the floor and decided to attack from below. But Calix had time to react and immediately raised his foot and knocked the knife out of his hands. When he saw the knife fall to the ground, he immediately rushed to attack and yelled for the monster to go to hell. The monster didn't realize how all this happened, and Calix was so angry that he stuck his sword into his chest. The blow was so strong that his sword pierced even a tree and held the monster in the air. Calix was immediately relieved and knelt right in front of the monster. He began to chastise himself for not saving Alba, and didn't feel like he was playing a game at all. After all, he had almost lost his life. But suddenly a system opened up in front of him and showed the prince that he had defeated a rank D monster. Each time his level began to increase and reached level 11. And as a prize, he received an inventory. Calix didn't even realize what other inventory the kind system offered him. But nearby, he heard someone approaching and shouting his name. Seeing Kraut nearby, he came to his senses a little. The knight walked over and hoped his prince was safe. But looking around and seeing a few monsters killed, he couldn't believe his eyes. He started to wonder what it was. But out of panic, he picked up his prince and started to see if he was hurt. The prince answered him that he was fine, and inquired how things were going on the main front. Kraut replied that luckily the snow monsters retreated after he killed 2 of them, and lucky they didn't push it to the limit. The prince thought for a moment and realized that it was definitely not luck. Lyra had successfully completed her mission, but the prince remembered about Alba and told the knight that one of his men was lying there. Kraut didn't understand at first and decided and asked the prince if he was really talking about Alba. The prince replied that was correct and wanted to know where Alba was now. Kraut pointed his finger at his body, but the prince slowly turned his head and saw the dead body. He didn't think even that day that someone would die in their sortie. However, Alba turned out to be one of those who bid farewell with his life. And the prince chastised himself and thought if only he had noticed him, and he felt guilty. Kraut came up and told the prince he shouldn't say that. He had died like a true knight. But the prince got very angry and told him not to kid himself. And is there such a thing as dying with honor? Death really is death. Kraut felt terrible too, because this was also the first time he was losing a subordinate. But there was nothing to be done about it. The prince did not move away from Alba's body for a long time, and even saw with his eyes how the other knights were burying him. But anger just covered him entirely and decided to ask what their situation was. Kraut began to report that they had lost 3 knights. 11 received minor wounds, and he thinks it's safe to say that their damage is insignificant in this situation. The prince still thought it was his fault. If only he had applied his knowledge and persuaded them all, no one would have died. It was only because of the trap Lyra had set beforehand that he was still alive, and he is grateful to Alba for protecting him. The prince couldn't bear such pain, and out of anger he clenched his fists and began to shout in front of everyone. The knights looked at all this and were shocked. The prince asked them, what do they do with the bodies of the dead during the operation? Kraut replied that if the situation allowed, the bodies would be preserved and brought home. The prince understood and told them to get on with it. Kraut decided to order his men, but turning around he was shocked at what he saw. The knights were so touched that they all let a tear fall. They felt that their lord was so kind to them. Thomas decided to appeal to the prince, but in his mind he realized that he would definitely protect him at the cost of his life. Kraut even noticed that everyone's attitude had changed, and they finally opened their hearts to the prince. After a while, Kraut approached the prince and said that they were ready to leave. All the preparations were complete, and they had taken care of the bodies of the dead as well. And everyone is already awaiting his orders. Calix immediately saw that these men were looking at him very differently, and so this is no time to be depressed by guilt. And he needs to instill hope in these people. Calix decided to speak up and said that the battle with the monsters was really hard, and they should arrive at their destination as soon as possible. But they must not forget the most important thing. Healthy people have no right to neglect caring for the wounded. He would never allow them to abandon their comrades. He finished his speech and asked his men if they understood everything. The knights became so devoted to him that they all answered with glee. About an hour ago, Lyra was in the forest and was following human footsteps, when suddenly a monster appeared in front of him who flew at her with his huge fist. Lyra dodged his blow and realized that things were bad because the monster had noticed her. Lyra immediately pulled out her knife and with a strong swing sent it straight into the tree. But the monster kept up with her and was ready to tear her to pieces. But Lyra used her rope and started jumping like a monkey. As she climbed up the tree, she realized that she had to hurry. Each time she used her knife and rope to move around. But as she descended to the ground, she felt a strong wind, and turning around, the monster was already behind her. But at the last moment of touching her, her trap went off, and the thread went straight into the monster's suit. Lyra immediately realized that she had caught it, but the monster was already unconscious, for the thread had just ripped its mouth open. But everything changed the second he came to his senses, and with both hands he simply tore the trees together with the roots. Lyra didn't expect this, and was a bit shocked at this turn of events. The monster's hand immediately reached for the girl, but Lyra picked the perfect moment and dodged the grasp. She decided to start fighting it already, and reaching out her thread between its neck, she immediately pulled it taut so that the monster couldn't breathe. After that, she stepped aside and decided to catch her breath a bit, and thought she had succeeded. Her fishing line was wrapped around the monster's neck, and it's so thin you can't grab it with your fingers. But when she heard the trees start to crack, she realized it was useless. But the monster couldn't reach her anyway. But it turned out to be much simpler. The monster began to pull the fishing line with his body and slowly chopped the tree. Lyra saw this and asked him if he was trying to take down trees. She immediately pulled out a siren temptation from her back pocket and thought she could take him down, but was unsure of that and decided to test it out. Finding the perfect moment, she got under him, and with a wave of her hand, she sent the siren's temptation straight into his body. And she managed to get the thing in, but it would definitely work on such a huge monster. She felt that she had no choice but to trust him and wait. After that, the monster became even angrier, and with his body and strength began to crumble everything around him, breaking even the trees. Finding himself free, the monster didn't even realize what was happening to him. Everything in front of him was a blur. The monster didn't even know what was happening to him, and Lyra calmed down, because finally the monster was defeated, and she didn't believe until the very end that it would really work. And she doesn't want to admit it, but he's even better at poisons than she is. And it's very strange that the man has changed so much in one night. Lyra took out the poison and remembered that she had been watching and serving him for a year. However, he seemed like a completely different person now, but began to deny it immediately and stayed on the fact that she was overworked. It even seemed to her that this was a revenge she would never be able to take again, but anything in this life is possible. As they traveled, Calix looked at his knights and saw how difficult it was for them to move. He became heavy at heart and ordered Kraut to have them take a short break. After a break, Calix immediately walked over to the knights with a bag of potion and told them to drink it. The knights saw the red water and immediately realized it was a potion, but they could not take it from the prince. But the prince threw a bottle in each of their hands and told them to drink it quietly and get well. Kraut, seeing this, asked the prince what he was doing. The prince at once answered that one great trouble had come to him. But Kraut said that although these potions were of low quality, they were still terribly expensive. Viscount Russell had prepared them especially for the prince. But Calix replied that these 10 bottles were taken from the count's stock. Indeed, he was furious at the knight's reproaches. And now he tells Kraut to shut up and listen to his prince. They have wounded fighters who are suffering, and Kraut is now suggesting that he turn a blind eye to it. The knight was surprised and replied that no way. Everyone was surprised at the prince's decision to help the wounded knights. But the prince told him not to be afraid of anything. After all, when they achieved their goal in their expedition, they would be able to drink such potions as if they were water. Suddenly raising his head, Kraut turned to the prince and told him to look ahead. The picture was that all the knights just stood in front of him and bowed. Calix had not expected such a thing. After all, he had heard it said that a knight would sacrifice his life for the one he swore to. And he is sure that every fighter feels that he has met the lord he truly wants to serve. The prince said it was time to depart. But at this moment, Kraut was in shock and was laughing with joy. Calix, seeing this, asked him, "What is that look on his face?" and let the preparations end quickly. Calix had done everything and knew he was ready to go on his journey. But seeing the system above him, he knew his reputation had been enhanced. He immediately rejoiced at the fact that he had succeeded, and into the night set out on a new journey. Calix was looking all the time in the distance, and seeing something he immediately ordered everyone to stop moving. Kraut asked what had suddenly happened. Calix got down from the wagon and replied that they had arrived at their destination. But Kraut didn't realize where they had arrived as he saw that the prince was not doing well. He looked around and he didn't see any movement nearby, and he thinks this place is already abandoned. Calix asked if there was any word from Lyra, but the knight replied that there was nothing and had not received anything in such a long time. Calix thought and ordered them to make camp here. The knight was surprised and didn't understand why here. The prince replied that right here. Immediately they need to pitch their tent where he is standing now. Calix immediately opened the map and began to say that he predicted that this is where the Kasharin family's secret vault was located. Kraut replied that they were close to it after all. The prince said that was correct. It is a bit far from their camp. But Kraut got angry and showed that it wasn't a little far at all. If this map is accurate, it would take about a week to get to this point. So far, the soldiers had endured such a harsh journey on sheer fortitude alone. But if they have to stomp for another whole week, it's certain that more than half of the knights in their squad won't be able to finish this journey. Thomas walked over to the table and said he was sorry, but they would have to stay here for a while. And there was a high chance of being found by the enemy. He might have already detected signs of battle. Calix was beginning to think they were just snot-lout. So he asked the knight if he didn't get it. He only told them the location of the vault, but he didn't say anything about going there. Kraut was shocked and began to question, wasn't the purpose of the expedition to rob their enemy's treasury? The prince replied that that was correct. We just need to go inside and then walk to the entrance of the vault. Calix stepped a few steps aside, and feeling another kidney, he pressed a secret button under his feet, and the secret entrance to the treasury opened. The knights were so surprised that they didn't even realize there could be such a thing lurking here. A wall opened in front of the prince, into which he had to enter the code. Kraut looked with open pupils at the whole thing and told the knights to look too. But Calix was sure of it, and was glad he didn't waste much time looking for the door. He immediately ran to go into the secret entrance. But Kraut caught him by the back and wouldn't let him in, and said it was dangerous and they would go first. The prince answered them to do whatever their hearts desired. Nothing would happen to him anyway. But suddenly Kraut expressed a desire to know more about it, but not sure if he should ask where he got such valuable information from. The prince replied that it wasn't valuable. He wasn't really sure it was reliable. It's just that if you don't have any information, then what's the point of starting to do anything? And he thinks he's not the simpleton he used to be, though it's hard to believe. Kraut didn't understand how this was happening, but Thomas stepped forward and said he believed the prince. Kraut didn't like that, but Thomas explained that if the prince really cared about even the lowest-ranking soldier, he believed there was a good reason for that ambition. The other knights, upon hearing such words, immediately started shouting that they believed him too, and they will be loyal to the prince, and they would be honored to die in the line of duty. But the prince explained to them that now he was just an ordinary weakling who didn't even know how to use mana, and such a mediocre man they were willing to trust with their lives. But Thomas shows the prince that they will become his strength. He believes that the man in charge has an inner core. Calix was shocked to see Krautu's face and asked, "Is he crying?" Knight replied that it was so touching. He was so proud of him. Calix stood up in front of everyone and said that some of their wounded knights are now fighting death as best they can, and every second counts, so they need to hurry up. Entering the secret entrance, but Calix stayed at the end and looked up at the sky, hoping Lyra was doing well. Lyra at this point collected the monster's blood and ended up with it, and seeing the tunnel in front of her decided it was time to play with the fire. She took 2 stones and with strong blows tried to reproduce the spark and burn the monster to cover her tracks. After doing this, she moved a short distance away and realized that the monsters should gather here. After all, snow monsters were still walking around. But turning around, she heard the strange footprints and realized that the main problem was something else. She realized that she had calculated it right, and they were right there, and wondered what would happen to those who went over people's heads for the sake of climbing the career ladder, and decided to fight them and show them what she was really capable of. The investigator looks at the square and decides it's a contingency. There are no human corpses or bones left behind by monsters, and he's sure that some of the survivors made a mess of the place, which means they fought back against the snow monsters, and there is only one force in this neighborhood that can handle such foes, and he should give it to Viscount Servio as soon as possible, and it remained for him to seal this letter with wax. Lyra watched all of this and saw the scout sealing his report. The girl drooled on her finger and pulled it outside and realized where the wind was blowing from. She didn't waste any time and opening the jar emptied all the monster blood she had collected beforehand. Leaving such a trace on the tree, she immediately disappeared. The scout didn't even see the people moving behind him, but Lyra had thought of everything in advance and made sure that the monsters were all in the vicinity. The monsters were very angry, but the foremost used his sense of smell and sensed the blood. After that, he immediately gave orders to his monsters to follow him, and headed along the scent of blood. The scout was watching everything, and realized that the scouting squad was about to be destroyed, and he needed to report it urgently. At the last moment, he immediately hid behind the trees and watched from afar. He thought he was saved. But abruptly he felt a warmth in his chest, and an intense pain. Lyra had done her job so perfectly that the scout didn't even realize how it happened, and threw him to the ground. But she immediately came down after him, and finding the letter, made sure that this was it, and she must tell the prince as soon as possible. But first she would take care of the corpse. But Lyra immediately got the hell out of there, and the monsters immediately came running after her and sniffed the body. The prince and his knights went down to the basement and were still on their way. Calix thought this was just surreal. This place was originally a retired wizard's home. He had equipped it with the intention of doing his research in silence until he died. But what kind of fool would place a dangerous trap in his own home? But Kraut realized that he had to check this place out. Calix began to look at the wall and saw that this place was built by melting and solidifying stone and soil, and there isn't a single crack. This is incredibly complex magic, and this magician's retired class is at least 8th grade. And if he really wanted to set traps here, it wouldn't matter so much who would pass through here. But the prince had told them that before he realized anything, he would instantly die. Suddenly Kraut saw and made it clear to the prince that there was some room at the end of the passage, and immediately ordered Thomas that he would become the prince's bodyguard. The rest of us should immediately split into 2 groups and look all around this room. But Calix approached Kraut and wanted to take a promise from him that if he found mid-level healing potions, he would give them to the wounded warriors. Kraut did not refuse the prince and made the promise. But Calix immediately walked into the room and sat on the throne and talked about how cool it was here. But Kraut was bothered by this, and he approached the prince and asked how the Viscount of the Kosherin family had discovered these ruins. The prince thought about it and replied that it might be by accident, or maybe someone just provided him with the information. But Kraut remembered that he even had a key in the form of a magic crystal ball. Suddenly, Calix replied that it wasn't like that. And it's not just a thing. No matter how strong a mage is, the magic he uses will weaken over time. But maintaining such enchantments is beyond the power of a simple wizard from the street. So he decided to find out who Lord Viscount Servio was. The knight replied that it was the Marquis Actonio. The prince immediately realized that Actonio would need more training. Kraut suddenly told the prince that, as he had said earlier, it was safe here. He also found a couple potions here, so he brought them to the prince. Calix took a look and gave him orders for him to distribute them to the wounded. But Kraut still thought they were creepy, expensive things. And the prince understood Kraut's feelings too, but to abandon his dying subordinates in an avoidable situation would be foolish. The prince asked them, had they discovered anything else? Knight replied that they found magical items for experiments, jewelry, medicinal herbs, water crystal, and more. And there are also some artifacts with support magic, but they are not that rare. Calix listened to everything and realized that somewhere in the status window there must be a valuable artifact. He started to look around and seeing the spot immediately ran towards it, but Kraut stood in front of him and held out his hand and stopped him. The prince did not like this and asked, "What now?" The knight replied that although they had finished their investigation, he was still not completely sure that all the places in this vault were safe. So he asked the prince to refrain from trying to act alone. The prince agrees and gives him permission to do as the charter commands, for even if she told him no, he would not obey. They both walked over to the wall, and squinting, the prince felt that there must be a switch somewhere in that area. Suddenly, Calix got right on it with his finger and opened a secret entrance. Bright light began to cut into their eyes. They didn't even realize what was behind that door. Seeing the incredible orb in front of them, Kraut said it was hard for him to even imagine that such a place really existed. And that's the staircase they were descending. You can see every corner of the dungeon from here. And Calix realized that this was just an ordinary surveillance room. But suddenly, Kraut said out loud that he had found something strange. Calix asked what exactly. Kraut replied that he was sure he had thoroughly explored the inside of the ruins, but this room he hadn't seen. Calix said that apparently this was the fake ruins, and he had heard that fake rooms were often erected near ancient ruins and the wizard's laboratory in case thieves broke in. Many people are attracted to places with valuable things. Kraut replied that means this is the Kosharin family's secret vault. The prince said, thinking that this was most likely the end point of their expedition. Kraut rejoiced and realized that this was why the prince said that he could steal the money without going into the secret vault. In fact, the prince realized that he had seen something like this before in the game. And taking both hands on the orb, he thought about how to open the door with it, and needing to visualize the desired functionality in his head. Kraut was looking at all this and saying under his breath that the prince was skillful with a complex artifact, and perhaps he had magical talent. Calix tried to open the door, but the night was very noisy. Suddenly, Kraut heard a strange sound and asked what it was. The prince ordered that he should immediately go and check what happened there. Kraut, seeing this, replied to the prince that a passage had appeared here, and it leads to the fake ruins. Calix came out and was ready to rush to those ruins and grab the silver that Gerard is hiding here. And it's here, but still controlling the device to see different places. He looked around the inside of the fake ruins, and there's a door he's never seen before, and it's the entrance to the silver mine. And inside the fake ruins is the entrance to the Kosharin family's main source of income. But Kraut replied that he wondered how they mined silver without attracting the attention of the royal family, and he didn't think anyone could do it that way. Calix said that there were no humans to be seen anywhere, and from the looks of it, the mining was taking place over a period of time. Kraut immediately felt a little creepy, and if the miners were able to get back to town, everyone would know about it. The prince replied that it sounded horrible, and there was no way Kraut would forgive them for such a despicable act. The prince told him to keep his head up. He would make sure it never happened again. We need to render the crystal ball unusable. All we have to do is change the security code and the connection settings. If this stone passageway is destroyed, Gerard will never be able to enter again, and I thought I'd leave him a little present. And it's time to start moving all the silver boxes. And as soon as they finished, they should not forget to put the scroll they had prepared in advance. Kraut immediately thought about it, but Calix saw his face and asked, "What's wrong?" He had already checked everything here, hadn't he? And could he be alone? Kraut replied that he understood and would fulfill the order by returning to the prince as soon as possible. The prince watched with his eyes as the knight left, and immediately relaxed because he was alone. He immediately set about figuring it out, and realized that if he remembered correctly, it should be somewhere this way. Finding a secret button, he pressed it, and immediately a secret safe opened in front of him. He remembered that this thing didn't look as cool in the game. Immediately, a window appeared in front of him with information about the bracelet. The bracelet was of the great mage Alchem, and once the wearer was mortally wounded, it would be covered by a protective membrane for 72 hours. However, the protective layer will break down if the shield is subjected to further attacks. If not properly treated in time, the wearer will die. and the recharge is equal to 1 week, starting from the activation of the magic item. There is a limit of 3 uses. Calix realized that he was still weak, so this artifact was perfect for him. Putting it on, he rejoiced at the fact that he now had 3 lives, and thought it was time for them to get out of here. But suddenly he saw some writing in the safe and didn't realize what it was. He saw that there were letters that were black in color and glowing, and he could only read that the inscription was addressed to Mrs. Hecatria, and he couldn't make out anything else, and it's amazing that he understood anything at all. He remembered the name and realized he had heard the name in the game. Hecatria was supposed to be the goddess who introduced people to the magic system, but in the game, he didn't have the kind of place he found himself in. It had something to do with him being in this world. Calix touched the notes, and immediately a spark went off and his hand just fell through the wall. Opening his eyes, he saw that he was in darkness, and didn't realize what was even going on here. Coming down to the white light, he saw a huge iron eye in front of him, and realized that it was a sacred relic. And if it was, there was a goddess sitting on the other side of it. He immediately began to feel feelings of irritation. He grabbed his head and didn't know what it was. It was like they were trying to smash his head in. The goddess began to shout that it was too inhumane. Inhumans don't belong here. What was he doing here anyway? But a water orb appeared in front of her and told Hecatria that the decision had already been made by the majority, and she didn't think they would break the treaty. The goddess replied that she didn't agree and it was all nonsense, and she considers it a disgrace. And if he wants to be that kind of man, then she will do as he wishes. The goddess clawed at the water orb with her claws and wanted to destroy it. Calix at this point considered that horrible song that gave him goosebumps, and didn't understand why he was the only one who thought that. And he can't hear anything, and that makes him even more scared. The goddess at this point began to tear up even more, and slowly her body began to disappear. But this made Calix even worse that he couldn't even stand it. The water sphere turned to Hecatria, but then realized that she had already lowered herself to the level of a demigod, and whether it was appropriate to call her by that name. And now from now on, she would be an object of hatred and scorn, and the people she loved so much along with these insects, they will be cornered where they will meet their tragic end. But what a face he makes this time. He's really looking forward to seeing it one last time. Opening his eyes, Calix just suddenly came to his senses and didn't know if it was over already. But seeing the system window, he was just dumbfounded that he had gotten the skill class ability. The system showed that he had received the first fragment of Hecatria's power, and obtained the skill foam Tarim dagger from the feathers of the fallen goddess. Calix was simply shocked at his new skill, and usually knew that skills range from the lowest F rank to the highest S rank. And there are also exceptions of unique skills, but authority is a different conversation altogether. These abilities can be used by masters starting at the 10th rank and above. This level of skill is called the demigod class. A person's authority is actually the development of his own body, and is the only way to reach 10th grade. But another window opened in front of him, and he didn't realize what it was at first. After reading in the window, he learned that he needed to swallow fragments of authority for further grade advancement. And from the looks of it, the one who sent him to this world must be the goddess Hecatria. Authority-level skills could be considered the only way to wound a god, and instead of the goddess Hecatria, he must take revenge on the other gods. Calix thought for a moment and suddenly started laughing out loud, because he realized the true purpose of this game, and he feels like he's being manipulated, but he doesn't care about that yet. He needs to get everything here first. Just then, Kraut came to him. The prince turned around and asked if they had moved everything from here. Kraut immediately asked the prince not to be too surprised. Calix didn't know what to think anymore, but showing him the prince looked at it all with huge eyes. He said that they had hauled so much stuff in just half an hour, and there were 6 boxes of gold alone, and he prayed there'd be at least 3, and it turned out there was a lot more than he'd realized. Kraut started showing everything and told him to look at the 420 silver bullion cases, and according to his calculations, that's the equivalent of tens of millions of gold. And it certainly wouldn't be easy for the members of the expedition to transport such a large amount to their territory. Calix realized that, in other words, the more money, the less trouble they would have. And it didn't matter how many crates there were. After all, he actually has the inventory, and how he would like to finally use it. Kraut saw the prince's look and turned to him, but the prince replied that it was nothing, and asked the knight to put all the crates here. Putting everything in front of the prince, Kraut said it was ready. The prince asked, "Is this all they found?" Calix understood and told them to get ready to get out of here. Kraut understood the order, but in his head he wondered what the prince was going to do. The prince knew that there was no such thing as a player or skill in this world, and most likely they wouldn't understand what an inventory was, and there was no need to try hard and hard to make them understand. So it's best to just simplify their understanding. But Thomas went up to the prince and said, "Now that everyone is outside, what are they going to do with so many boxes?" The prince answered him that it's nothing like that. He just has this space bracelet right here, and it's a first-class artifact, and he thinks it has enough space to fit all these crates inside. Thomas looked, and he didn't know such an artifact existed. Calix told him that he wished to keep it a secret. Thomas replied that it must be very expensive, so it would be safest if as few people as possible knew about it. And even if they roast him, he won't say a word. Calix turned around and thanked the knight. But he also learned that when one looks at an object, a status window appears. And if you think of the inventory like that in this state, he noticed immediately that the artifact in his inventory, just like in the game, was. Looking at the box of silver, he moved it into his inventory. He rejoiced that he had succeeded, and now he wanted to move everything in sight. Seeing the accumulation of his inventory, he felt that the thick wallet added so much to his confidence. Then he had nothing to fear. Emptying the entire room, he said it was time to get out of here. Going upstairs, the knights greeted him. Kraut said everyone was ready to go, but the prince asked if Lyra was here yet. Kraut replied that she hadn't yet, and maybe she betrayed his majesty and ran away. And to be honest, he didn't trust her from the beginning. But Kraut couldn't resist and asked the knight if he still thought that the retreat of the snow monsters was a mere coincidence. Hearing such words, Kraut simply froze in shock. He didn't know what to say. Calix had told the knights everything in detail. He explained that Lyra had helped them. Kraut couldn't believe it. That Lyra attacked the snow monster's hideout alone. That would be suicide. And sure, he didn't trust her much, but he had no desire for her to just die like that. Calix replied that he wanted to use a different method. Who had ignored his suggestion then? Would they give him a clue? Kraut thought, and realized that he had decided it would be dangerous to try an untested tactic. However, looking at the result, the prince was right. Calix said Lyra still hasn't returned. Perhaps something had happened to her, and thanks to her, he didn't have to make any great sacrifices. So now it's their turn to help her, and they should agree with him now. Kraut made up his mind and shouted that they would only go after the prince. Kalisk immediately thought he was pathetic. The others also picked up after the commander and made it clear that they agreed, but in reality, he didn't do anything in this expedition. It's just holding him back, and pathetic. And since at least he's a knight, he has to fulfill his obligations. Calix agreed and asked Kraut to have him pick the fastest knights, and let the rest wait for them in the basement. But Calix knew from experience that one of two things could have happened to Lyra. She had met the boss of the snow monsters, or she was being pursued by people from the organization to which Lyra belonged. But his choice leaned towards the boss being the cause after all. In that time, they would have been caught by now, or they would have noticed the surveillance. And what's more, Lyra would probably have erased all traces of it. She wouldn't have done anything careless that could lead to a chase after them. And the question would be how they would find her. But his thoughts just sealed his expression. But then Kraut came up and asked the prince what he was going to do. The prince replied that right now they will go to the snow monster boss and take revenge on him. Kraut asked if he was serious. Calix ordered immediately that he should put this medicinal herb in oil, boil it, and smear his weapons with it. Kraut asked for what purpose should they do this. The prince replied that he should simply do as he was told, and it was worth the annoyance. Kraut apologized and said he would do it right away. The prince actually thought and wished that Lyra had waited for him. Arriving at the site, Calix said that in theory only women and children should be inside the tunnel. The males were chasing Lyra, who had destroyed their hideout and would be busy getting food, and need to get rid of everyone inside. If they do, the males will notice it and run after them. Kraut replied that they were going to follow the trail of the males that were chasing Lyra. But will everything be all right? And as the prince knows, they are very uneasy enemies. Calix let him know that he was about to see just how good this poison was. Kraut looked at his sword and saw the poison slowly dripping down his iron. Kraut immediately took his knights and burst into the tunnel, began to fight the monsters. Inside the tunnel, screams began to be heard immediately, and the squeals of the monsters. Calix sensed them too and shouted that the monsters were coming, and they need to hide and follow the tracks of the male. Following the trail, Calix was telling everyone to get inside, and due to the fact that they literally tore right away, the tracks are very clear. Kraut replied that that's right and he can see the same thing. Suddenly, Calix got tired of running and jumped on Thomas and said that there's no way these little brats can beat Lyra, and would take the biggest trails. Thomas started to immediately run down the huge footprints. Suddenly, he asked the prince if he liked it. The prince did not understand and asked the knight what he meant. Thomas replied that he was talking about Lyra, and she is good in her own way. The prince told him not to piss him off and concentrated on tracking. Thomas replied that still he didn't expect her to volunteer for such a dangerous mission. The prince said then she needed them too, because they are the only place where she can survive. And he knew it was true that on Earth her beauty would be enough to make her a popular model, but that's not the reason. Perhaps he was doing it because of the need for his own survival. After all, the first continental event that takes place in this game is the invasion of the kingdom of Jaipur. And at that time, the most active force would be the mountain ranger. And it seemed to him that he was just a volunteer soldier. But perhaps some force like Viscount Servio had deliberately cultivated him. Opening his eyes in the tunnel, Kraut saw that he had won. The knights began to say that they had completely destroyed him. And it was just as the prince said. They weren't injured at all, but Kraut replied that there was no time to rest, and they need to go after the prince. After the tunnel, they immediately took the path out to catch up with their prince. Kraut knew in his heart that he respected the prince with all his heart, and asks him to keep him safe. At this moment, the body of the unidentified man was in the woods. Upon arriving, Calix immediately saw that there was a body lying in the distance, and it looked like Lyra, and her body was surrounded by evil wolves. Thomas immediately drew his sword and started fighting them, and the prince walked over to the body to examine her. Thomas began to swing his sword and immediately cut off the first wolf's head. Calix looked over her body and asked her to hold on, and didn't think she had been roughed up like that, and hoped this potion could help her. Calix pulled out the potion and immediately poured it over her wound. Lyra felt a great pain, and her whole body began to sting. Calix realized that she was alive, and saw that the wound was slowly healing, but he would have to give her another potion so she could recover faster. That's when Thomas came running in and said that he had chased all the creatures away. Calix praised her and asked for his help to roll her over onto her back. Calix lifted her head up and decided to pour a potion into her mouth. She drank it and immediately came to her senses. Calix started to smile at seeing the blush on her face. Thomas was happy too and thought the potion worked great. But then Kraut and the rest of the boys came running in. Calix immediately showed that they were up to the task. A week later at Count Shaken's castle, Calix gave himself a training session on his territory in the morning. He saw that he was now at level 18. For a grown man with average skills, that number is somewhere in the neighborhood of 20. So for him, a 15-year-old teenager, that wasn't a bad result. Russell looked at all this and said that it hadn't been that long since he started training, but his physical strength was already impressive. And it looks like his body isn't as simple as they thought. Kraut replied in agreement. It's not at all like the level when they were camping, and maybe he secretly ate something. Russell punched the knight suddenly in the head and called him a scoundrel. And Calix was very excited, because he saw that the next level was very close. Kraut asked when they should resume his swordsmanship training. Russell answered him to take his time. And for such practices you need a perfectly healthy body, so let him recover for now. But then Calix came in all sweaty and asked, "Is the training over?" He had something to do in the magic tower today. Kraut asked, surprised to hear about the magic tower. Calix replied that was correct, and now he's going to go take a bath, and Kraut needs to get ready for their departure. Kraut replied that he understood and would go do it, and further told Russell that he has a lot of trust in the prince. And truth be told, he still doesn't understand the man. And yet one thing he can say for sure, he is an incredible man. And in other words, the prince cared about the people that serve him and his family. So he dared not himself to restrain Mr. Calix by feeding himself unnecessary doubts. Russell replied that at first he just had to stand by him and take care of him. But right now, all he can do is monitor the man's thoughts and actions. Kraut said that, however, he still needs a teacher. His authority is still too low, and there's nothing he can do about it. He is still 15 years old, and he has no official rank. Soon the prince will have to finish his coming-of-age ceremony and move up to the 4th grade. Kraut replied that the prince is growing up fast, so that won't be a problem. Russell said yes. And when Earl Colin passed away, he was concerned that dark clouds were hanging over their territory. But he didn't expect someone so suited to succeed him to show up so soon. The lion cub was a lion too, after all, albeit a small one for now. After bathing, Calix and his knight arrived at the magical tower of Shaken Territory. But upon opening the door, they were greeted by a girl. The girl was immediately surprised and began to say that she was visited by a handsome boy and a strong man. She is always very happy to meet handsome men and asks them to kindly sit down. Calix expected this from a mage who doesn't care about status. The girl said they must be thirsty, and with the help of magic placed tea glasses in front of them. And in order to warm the teapot, she just put her palms on it and heated it up. And suddenly steam came out of the kettle. "It's amazing! In such a shabby place there's a Class 5 magician," and immediately opened the window to look at her stats. Calix watched and said it was amazing. But the girl asked, "What are they so surprised about?" The prince replied that he honestly didn't think that she, being such a high achiever, and would live in a rural area away from the city, and her gestures are very elegant. Kraut was surprised and expected the same from his prince. The girl immediately told the prince bluntly that he was a pleasant conversationalist. But Calix replied that if she is able to heat a kettle so quickly, then her class is definitely not lower than 5th. And she has such skills already in her 20s. He was simply amazed. How is that possible? Only if she is the apprentice of a magic tower master? The girl replied that she was so embarrassed, and Kraut immediately said that she wasn't 20. But the girl said straightforwardly that although she's a little over 20, but she really is the apprentice of the tower master. There is nothing special about that, but she is about 30. Calix was surprised and answered her that she doesn't look her age. Is there some secret? The girl replied that she didn't do anything like that. And it's probably all due to the fact that she gets a good night's sleep and washes her face with fresh water. Calix listened and said that's pretty cool, and she looks great. After drinking the tea, girl asked them what fate had brought them to visit him today. Calix replied that actually he came to buy an explosion scroll. The girl was happy to hear that, because this guy was also a great customer. She immediately told them that she had 30 scrolls for 600 gold pieces, but she always gives a discount to handsome boys. She could give them 500. Calix replied that she shouldn't force herself. And he realized one thing, that a pretty face could really get some use out of a pretty face. And Kraut counted all the cost and came to a benefit of as much as 100 gold to them. The girl told them not to worry. Even if this magic tower looks decrepit, it doesn't affect the authority of the tower head in any way. But Calix revealed that he actually had another request. The girl asked him that he should not be shy and tell. The prince replied that it was hard for him to talk about it, but he would like to borrow some money. When the girl heard about the money, she was shocked, because she didn't expect it. She asked how much they needed. Calix answered them they needed 60,000 gold pieces. When the girl heard that, she was shocked and even spilled her tea, but she told them that she was not ready for such a thing. Calix replied that he understood, and yet, on their part, they would deposit gold or silver bars as collateral. And of course, as long as they rented, then would commit to paying interest as well. The girl wondered what the other benefit was. The prince replied that it was a regular loan, but for a short term plus monthly interest. He realized that if he repaid the debt to Gerard using the ingots they had stolen, it would be like admitting that they were the very thieves. The girl explained that they would agree on an appropriate percentage that suited them both. The prince realized that he would not be able to borrow such a sum anywhere else, and it was absolutely necessary to borrow money from her. But the girl, after thinking about it, said that she was sorry, but she thought it would be a bit difficult. Calix got angry and thought that he lacked sympathy, and a little rushed. The girl decided to offer another option, saying that she didn't think her master would ever allow it. But there is one way, and as they could see, it was a place the head wasn't particularly interested in, and it would be best if they kept it a secret between the three of them. Calix decided to check with her. The secret remains between the three of them. The girl immediately replied that if he pays back the debt within 6 months, there is no problem. But after 6 months, she would sell all the gold and silver bars that he would leave her as collateral. Calix rejoiced, for he had everything going according to plan. She's a mage who always needs funds for research. The girl changed the conversation and said the tea was just really good, and the prince was sure she was madly eager to get interest on the 60,000 gold, and let her know that he would appreciate it if she could do that. And Kraut felt goosebumps, and thought it was cool. The girl replied that, as she expected, socializing with the heir of a noble family was truly extraordinary. And Calix realized that his debt was now repaid. Milkus was receiving people the next day and told one servant to bring the card immediately. The servant replied that he would bring it right away. Milkus was so angry that he couldn't even feel his body from trembling. He knew that a whole group of scouts were guarding the safe, but still everything was gone. Just then a servant came running in and said he had brought a map. Milkus examined it and saw that there were tracks left by the missing group in this place, and to follow the mountain trail to the entrance of the secret vault would take more than 10 days, but one day would be enough if you went in a straight line. Milkus inquired and immediately ordered that they go to the Gorda Plateau. Upon arriving, they were pounced upon by a huge golem. The warriors didn't know how they could defeat something like that, but the captain told them to calm down. Although the golem is huge, but its movements are slow and predictable, and they need to keep their distance and attack it all together. The warriors got under its arm and said that it was so huge that they wouldn't be able to dodge it. The golem didn't waste any time and knocked out one of the warriors with a single blow. The others were also frightened, and even said that it was the end. And if a night-class squad member was so easy to defeat, then they were just bipeds. The captain didn't let them talk like that, and finished off the warrior with his sword. He told everyone to make them stronger. But Golem saw this and immediately punched him with his huge hand. The blow was so strong that the warrior didn't even have time to dodge and swept the ground with his body. The warriors saw that Golem had taken out another knight. The moment the monster was already approaching them, Milkus was tired of looking at this picture and was already furious. But the captain of the knights didn't expect them to run into the golem. The captain said that he had heard that golems themselves were not found in nature. The warrior assumed and replied that there must be a mage hiding nearby and controlling it, and his class is no lower than 5. The captain turned to Milkus and reported that the damage to their army had already exceeded reasonable limits, and they should retreat immediately. But Milkus told them to stand their ground, and no matter what, he needs to send the Marquis the money in 3 days. And he tells them to clear the road within 24 hours, and if he can't, they'll all die here. Suddenly, a man approached the magic house, while the girl was talking about some kind of gift, and when she heard the knocking, she thought it was her lover coming to her. The prince just froze in place and replied that it couldn't be, but the girl said she wanted to get something from him. Lyra looked at this picture from the street and heard that it was the fox magician who invited the prince. Kraut came into the room with Lyra and said that he had moved everything that was needed to the Magic Tower warehouse. Lyra was so angry that she didn't even open her mouth, and Kraut handed over the box the prince had requested. The prince thanked them and sent them out the door to wait for him there. But Lyra decided to ask the knight, why on earth would the prince choose to flatter this mage? Kraut thought, what other kind of flattery? And he hoped he wouldn't tell her too much. The mage was so happy when she saw the gift that she said she was pleased, and asked the prince if he was really giving it to her. Calix replied that it was as a thank you for her kindness and agreeing to step into his position. The prince didn't even think that an artifact found in the ruins could be used in such a way. The mage asked, is it something like a promise? And she's sure the prince knows that there's a lot of paperwork that needs to be prepared to make it official, and there is no guarantee that permission will be granted. Calix thought that they don't want the interest he pays to be sent to the central magical tower. He replied that he would keep it in mind and hope for her continued support. The mage responded by saying that she was always happy to cooperate with him in selling scrolls, and decided to ask him where he was going to use those explosive scrolls. Or does the prince want to casually start a war? The prince realized that the position of the head of the magic tower was not given to her for nothing, extracting information at every opportunity. The prince smiled and jokingly replied that he would definitely not do such a thing. Only wants to use them to excavate the mine. The mage asked with surprise. For digging? Those scrolls are insanely expensive and he's using them for something like that? And had anything else been discovered at the gold mine? Calix immediately felt like he had to get the hell out of here. And lastly, he told her that she would find out the next time they met. And he's sure they'll be seeing a lot more of each other from now on. Looking at his inventory, he saw that he now had 100 scrolls for 600 gold. And now the county's huge debt will be paid off. But there's a problem. How will Gerard react when he realizes that his money has been stolen? And to Vicomte Servio, he's just a weed in the garden, which didn't stop him from ordering the assassination. But the assassin didn't succeed. And the prince here is sure he didn't expect this. Since he was attacked, he has no choice but to take revenge. And he's not done with his revenge yet. Calix realized that he just wished him death and humiliation. At this point, the knights were still fighting with the golem and trying to destroy it altogether. They managed to chain it up and bound it into a huge iron bolt that held it all together. Suddenly, the knights started shouting that they could see the cannonball, and the commander, seeing this, jumped on the core to destroy it. The touch of the sword was so fast that the golem exploded after that. The explosion was so strong that the rocks were scattered in different directions. Seeing the bodies afterward, the captain said that they had defeated the golem, but more than half of the warriors had died. Milkus immediately told him to quickly open the stone gate. Standing in front of the huge gate, Milkus said for the captain to hand him the key. The servant went over and brought his key in the shape of a ball. Placing the key on the gate, he waited a bit for it to activate. But the system told him he was an invalid user, and unauthorized access had been detected, and interception procedures would be followed, and asked the person to stay away from the entrance, and started the countdown. Milkus didn't understand why this was even happening. He set the key down again and decided to try again. But again he got the response that he was an invalid user. Milkus kicked his foot on the door in anger and asked why this was so, and why wasn't the key working. The knight told the lord to secure his own safety first, and then deal with the situation, and ordered the others to get Mr. Gerard to safety immediately. The door system immediately said that the first stage of interception was being activated, and all monsters within the specified radius would be summoned. On the way, Calix listened to Lyra and asked her who she heard that from. The girl replied that the prince was showing Roseanne his charm. Calix said that she makes it sound like he became her partner just to do something like that and break her heart, and something he didn't remember such a thing. Suddenly he turned to them, because he wanted to ask them something. What would happen if Gerard betrayed Viscount Servio? What could happen? Lyra asked. Why would he betray Servio? The prince asked. Is the Viscount so magnanimous that he would forgive his subordinates' mistakes? Lyra replied that of course that would not happen. He is more suited to the characterization of a strict perfectionist. This is a man who will never forgive a misstep. But Calix asked further, is Gerard the kind of person who will obediently accept death according to the Viscount's wishes? Lyra replied that it's just like the prince said. When he finds out that his money has been stolen, he will try any way he can to survive. And she doesn't think Gerard would betray Viscount without a dire need. Calix said he couldn't be defeated. Lyra immediately noticed that the prince was up to something again, and the prince thought, what exactly is this discomfort? And he felt like he was missing something. At this time in Plateau Gorda, the captain was saying that they had somehow managed to kill all the monsters, but their army was almost completely wiped out. But Milkus was so angry that he immediately ordered them to open the door for him. He realized that there was only one way to open it with a scroll of magic explosion. After that, the door would already be useless, but he had no other choice. The knights went to the door and blew it open completely, and notified the lord that it was ready, Milkus said without fear as they went inside. And he had a damn bad feeling about it. As they entered the far room, they saw that there was nothing here. Milkus panicked and told the knights to find him the money immediately, and he told them not to stand still, and they found him silver and gold. Suddenly, one of the knights saw scrolls on the floor and wondered what they were. Opening the scroll, there was a sudden bright light, after which there was a huge explosion in the room. Milkus fell to the ground and didn't understand why it happened like that. The knight said that the mine was blocked, and it looked like a magic trap had been activated. That's what caused the cave-in. And Milkus knew right away that he was finished. And at this rate, the Viscount would kill him for sure. And it looks like he's going to have to use Plan B. Milkus told the knight that he was immensely grateful to him. Looking at his man after that, the knight simply stuck his sword into his ally's chest, getting rid of the witnesses. Milkus lastly told the knight that everything was fine, and it wasn't his fault. It was just the way things were, and there was no other way to keep it a secret. And he apologizes to him. The captain told the lord that he felt that Keefe couldn't keep his mouth shut, and he's sure they'll notice something strange in the cave and decide to explore it. Milkus replied that the lot had already been cast, and Plan B is Plan B for that matter. By evening, Milkus arrived at Viscount Servio's estate, and immediately knelt before the Lord. The Vicomte said he was listening to him attentively. Milkus fell to the floor and replied that he was sorry, but the Viscount asked him to spare him. His regrets are meaningless. He is only interested in the outcome. What really happened to his money? Let him tell him in detail. Milkus replied that he thought it was the work of grave robbers. It seems they were digging an underground tunnel thinking it was just a normal ruin, and that's when they accidentally activated the security system. So it would take some time to clear the path. The Viscount asked, "Did most of the silver remain in place?" Milkus immediately began to tremble, but pulling himself together replied that it was all correct. And there was no need to worry. Those robbers wouldn't have been able to take everything with them. He's sure of it. And they had already sent a shadow squad there. They had already scoured a certain area. He's also secretly offered rewards to merchants who buy precious metals. And of course he has the backup plan. He'll ambush them. Silver coins are pretty heavy, so it's impossible to carry them all off in one go. So they'll come back to get the rest. If they could resist so much money, they wouldn't be called grave robbers. The Viscount stood up and ordered him to catch them as they returned. Milkus, hearing such words, thought all was well, and made it clear that he would punish them well and make them dump every last coin. Mikan opened his box and said that he understood the situation. However, he would still punish him, and pulled out a whip right from his box. Milkus was upset and wanted it to be over quickly, and going downstairs, Viscount started beating him with the whip. Milkus covered his head and just felt the pain of the whip penetrating him. After the blows, Viscount was asking how could he have screwed up so badly. Milkus at this point told himself that he would endure everything, because if he wanted to survive in this place, he had to endure. The Viscount had told the servant that he knew that Milkus didn't get along with Captain Cuff of the Shadow Squad, and now because of him, the crooked shit, the Shadow Squad he had spent a lot of time nurturing and was almost completely destroyed. The blow was so hard that Milkus's body fluid just hit him in the face. He said he didn't care about their skirmishes. But if it affects the others in the group, that's another conversation. And let him stop thinking he's a smart ass. If he needs help, he just has to ask for it. Milkus replied that he understood and it wouldn't happen again. The Viscount said that the problem was that he was going to send that money to Marquis Antonio, and it was possible to notify Shaken County that there would be a formal seizure procedure. And if he didn't offer the full amount, then Milkus would be in trouble. After all, he would have no choice but to sell his assets to the company to make up for the missing amount. Milkus raised his head after that and replied that he understood his favor. And in his mind he understood that this was his wealth that he had earned with blood and sweat. But Viscount let him go, and said lastly not to think that he was so easily forgiven. Let him find the silver, and he understood perfectly well what would happen to him if the jewels were not returned to their master. With difficulty, Milkus replied that he understood, and rising to his feet, he left the room. Coming out of the room with terrible wounds, a servant came running and asked the master if he was all right. Milkus was exhausted and couldn't even open his mouth. The servant got some water and asked him to drink it. His hands were shaking so badly that the jug was just dangling at his mouth. The servant brought a plaid and covered the Lord's wounds. Milkus said to apply the potion to his back as well. And what about Jacob? The servant replied that he hadn't been able to tell the Lord about it yesterday, but he had decided to get rid of him. He had proved to be useless. Milkus thought for a moment and asked, "Are there any other candidates?" The servant replied that he had recently found a child named Thar in the desert, and he has brown hair and emerald eyes. This child looks a lot like Calyx. Milkus was surprised and said that he must be dark-skinned, and he doesn't like him. Just have to hold out a little longer, though. Milkus asked how the training was going over there. The servant replied that they needed 3 more days. However, the pursuit will be a pain. And is the Lord sure they will be able to escape? Milkus replied that more than half of the Shadow Squad was dead or badly wounded, and those who are able to move have been scattered throughout the area to search for non-existent tomb raiders. And now is the best time, and what a perfect time they've got. And now they're off to Shaken Manor to collect their money. We need to gather more for a life of luxury after the escape. The servant wasn't really sure they would get the money from Calyx so easily. After all, he was able to deal with the issue of succession so quickly. A few days later, Kraut came to the master. Russell asked what was wrong. Kraut replied that Milkus had arrived at the estate, and it seemed to be about a debt. Calyx looked at that with surprise. Russell replied that their prince had assumed that, and ordered Kraut that he should accompany the prince. The knight looked surprised and asked if the master would not go with them. Russell replied that he had enough ability to lead the clan, and if he interferes so brazenly, he will undermine the prince's authority, and he has enough to protect the prince's back. Kraut listened and said he understood. Milkus sat back in his chair, and when he saw the prince, he said that he looked much better than last time. Calix immediately responded to him to spare him that speech. We need to get to the point quickly while he is still able to talk to him. Milkus said that he doesn't want to appear rude, so he'll just tell it like it is. The official foreclosure proceedings are about to begin, and he can't think of a single option in which the Shaken family will be able to pay the 60,000 gold pieces, and so he plans to take all the items that can be used as collateral. Calix asked, "What if he refuses?" Milkus replied that he will assign people to make sure they can't escape, and they would be under his constant control. Kraut got very angry and decided to finish him off by calling him foul language. Milkus started laughing and replied that violence is unacceptable. His opinion is very important when it comes to refunds, and this kind of behavior only makes things worse. Calix told the guest that if his decision is so important, can't the repayment be postponed for a good reason? Milkus replied that there is such an option, but in order to do so, they need to show their sincerity, and maybe then the situation would change a bit. Calix realized that it seemed to him then he would be losing money if he continued to pay off his debt to this peddler. And if you think about it that way, he came to him before the repayment date. Was he trying to talk him down? Or was he in urgent need of money? And that's when Calix realized it was the money. Looks like he's noticed it's missing, and now he wants to beat it out of him. Calix said flat out that he managed to collect the whole amount, so he doesn't need to show his sincerity, and he's sorry to disappoint him. Milkus immediately stood up and asked with surprise, "Did they collect the whole amount?" Calix asked him, "Why is he so surprised? Wasn't this great news for him?" He threw the papers at his feet and explained that they were bearer bonds issued by the Royal Chamber of Commerce, and he could check them out. Milkus could see that they were not counterfeit. They were able to prepare 62,000 gold pieces. But where did they get such a huge sum, he thought, and suddenly he began to think that if he got away with it, it would be much easier to move around with bonds than with coins. Besides, the easiest way to escape prosecution is to have a lot of money and live in a foreign country. And at the end, Calix remembered and put the silver plate on the table, and asked the guest if he would like to check it out too. There were 32 of these bars in a box, and the boxes were something like 13. Milkus realized that the prince might reveal that he was responsible for the theft of the silver bars, and he threatened to tell the Viscount. And the prince realized his plan, but began to deny and say it was impossible. After all, he's just a simple child. But anyway, if Viscount finds out about it, he will kill him and grieve his dogs. Calix asks him what would happen if by chance rumors spread that someone ran off with Viscount's dirty money. He would be well aware of the whole situation, wouldn't he? Milkus couldn't say anything in response, but Calix pointed his fingers and said there were 2 chairs he could sit on. Reveal everything and be punished, or betray the Viscount and escape. Milkus just started to grind his teeth in anger, but kept quiet. And the prince saw that the guest was now cornered, and it was time to give him a little hope. And he offered to help him survive and escape. An opportunity like this rarely comes along. Which would he choose? Kraut, listening to his words, realized that the prince had thought of something strange. Milkus answered that simply escaping would not be enough. Calix said that he would have to prepare a solid base that no one could touch. Milkus asked if that meant he would have to be under his command. Calix answered him that he was the butt of one of the most powerful men in this country. That was enough already. Milkus says then he needs a stronger support than he has, and asks the prince to provide it for him. The prince replied that he would by all means, but everything in their world comes at a price. First, they have to sign this, and then he tells him what he will do. Milkus saw the paper and immediately realized that it was a receipt for a full refund. This bond was also presented by the royal family. Milkus got excited and started laughing, but said it was fantastically wonderful, and maybe it will really work out, and he agrees to sign it. Milkus signed the paper and remembered for the future that he shouldn't cross this man's path. Calix smiled back and said that the Lord had made the right choice, and Milkus realized that he was someone he couldn't handle.